Hi everyone, I know you are watching this content to accompany your sleep. So before we start, I want to know where you are watching from and what time you are watching. Also, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Let's jump straight into the story. Story 1. In March 2004, a tragic event unfolded in Sidoarjo, East Java, Indonesia, that would leave an indelible mark on the community. The incident involved a construction laborer named Ilyas, who committed a heinous act against the family of a police officer. This case not only shocked the local residents, but also highlighted the vulnerabilities within domestic security. Ilyas had been employed as a construction worker at the residence of Daniel, a police officer stationed in Sidoarjo. Over time, Ilyas became familiar with the household's routines and the family members. On a fateful day in March 2004, Ilyas discovered a sickle, locally known as a celluret, within Daniel's home. Seizing the opportunity, he armed himself with the weapon and proceeded to carry out a brutal attack. His first victim was Christina, Daniel's 15-year-old daughter. Ilyas entered her room and, without hesitation, assaulted her with the sickle, leading to her untimely death. The brutality of the act was evident from the severe injuries inflicted upon the young girl. The motive behind this gruesome act remains a subject of speculation, with some suggesting personal grievances or possible psychological disturbances. The news of this atrocity spread rapidly, sending shockwaves through the Sidoarjo community. Residents grappled with the horror of such a violent act occurring within the perceived safety of one's home. The incident underscored the unpredictable nature of human behavior and the potential dangers lurking even in familiar environments. In the aftermath, law enforcement agencies intensified their efforts to apprehend Ilyas, who had fled the scene following the crime. The case prompted discussions about the importance of thorough background checks for domestic workers and the need for heightened security measures within households. It also served as a grim reminder of the potential threats posed by individuals in positions of trust. This tragic event from March 2004 remains etched in the collective memory of Sidoarjo's residents, serving as a cautionary tale about the unforeseen dangers that can arise within the confines of one's home. The discovery of Christina's body sent waves of horror through the neighborhood. It was Daniel himself who found his daughter lying lifeless on the floor of her room, blood pooling beneath her small frame. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood, and the walls bore silent witness to the sheer brutality of the crime. A father, sworn to protect and serve, was now forced to face the incomprehensible reality that his own home had been breached, his family torn apart by an act of unimaginable violence. His screams shattered the silence of the early evening, drawing neighbors out of their homes, their faces a mixture of curiosity and concern. But as the gravity of the situation became apparent, their expressions turned to horror. Some stood frozen, unable to process the sight before them. Others turned away, hands covering their mouths as they whispered prayers under their breath. The neighborhood, once a quiet and peaceful place, had become the scene of a nightmare. The police arrived within minutes. Officers who had once worked alongside Daniel now had the painful duty of securing the crime scene, their usual professionalism struggling against the weight of personal grief. Crime scene investigators moved quickly, photographing every detail, collecting samples, and searching for any evidence that might lead them to the murderer. They noted the forced entry into Christina's room, the disturbed state of her belongings, and most significantly, the absence of the sickle used in the attack. The weapon, it seemed, had been taken by the killer. Daniel, despite his years of service and experience with violent crimes, was unable to contain his grief. He collapsed onto the front steps of his home, his head in his hands, shaking with sobs. His colleagues gave him space, understanding that in that moment, he was not a police officer but a grieving father. The sound of his anguish echoed in the night, a painful reminder of the fragility of human life. Investigators immediately turned their attention to Ilyas, the missing laborer. A man of few words, Ilyas had always been regarded as quiet and reserved. He had never caused trouble, nor had he shown any signs of violence. Yet now, he was the prime suspect in a gruesome murder. His disappearance only deepened suspicions. The police wasted no time issuing a nationwide alert, knowing that every second counted. Word of the murder spread like wildfire, reaching local news stations and even making headlines in national newspapers. The brutality of the crime, coupled with the involvement of a police officer's family, made it a case that gripped the entire country. People were afraid. If a man could enter a police officer's home and commit such an atrocity, was anyone truly safe? Investigators began reconstructing the events leading up to the murder. Witnesses were interviewed, neighbors questioned. One resident, an elderly woman who lived next door, recalled seeing Ilias loitering near the house earlier that day. He had been staring at the windows, she said, his face unreadable. Another witness, a shopkeeper down the street, reported that Ilias had purchased a large amount of food and supplies 2 days prior. It was as if he had been preparing for something. The biggest breakthrough came when officers traced Ilias's last known movements. A local bus driver recognized his photograph, stating that Ilias had boarded a bus heading toward a remote village several miles away. Armed with this lead, police mobilized, hoping to capture the fugitive before he disappeared completely. The manhunt was officially underway. The search for Ilias consumed the days and nights that followed. Officers scoured the streets, combed through villages, and interrogated anyone who might have seen the fugitive. Every roadblock, every checkpoint, and every transport hub was monitored closely. The city of Sidoarjo, once known for its peaceful routines, now pulsed with an air of tension. No one could sleep soundly knowing that a murderer was on the loose, and for Daniel, the days dragged on like an eternity. His daughter's funeral had passed in a haze of grief, and now, the only thing keeping him from complete despair was the pursuit of justice. A week after the murder, a crucial tip came in. A fisherman in a small village along the Brantas River reported seeing a disheveled man matching Ilias's description, hiding near the riverbank at night. The police, not willing to take any chances, descended on the area in force. Officers spread out, combing through thick vegetation and checking abandoned huts. The chase had led them far from the crime scene, but their determination had not wavered. Late in the evening, a breakthrough came. A patrol officer noticed movement near a cluster of banana trees. He signaled to his team, and within seconds, floodlights illuminated the area. There, crouched in the dirt, was Ilias. His clothes were torn, his face sunken from days without proper food. His hands trembled as he realized he had been found. "Don't move," one officer shouted, gun raised. But Ilias did move. He bolted, his feet kicking up dirt as he sprinted toward the river, desperation fueling his every step. Officers gave chase, shouting for him to stop. He reached the edge of the water, the current swift and unrelenting. For a brief moment, he hesitated. Then, in a final act of defiance, or perhaps surrender, he plunged into the river. The officers reacted immediately. Some ran along the bank, trying to track him, while others called for backup. But the river was dark, its waters deep and unkind. Ilias struggled against the current, his arms flailing. Then, just as quickly as he had jumped in, he was gone. The officers watched as the river swallowed him whole. For hours they searched. Boats were dispatched, and divers braved the murky depths, but there was no sign of Ilias. It was as if the water had erased him from existence. Officially, he was declared missing, presumed drowned. But without a body, there was no closure. Daniel received the news with mixed emotions. His daughter's murderer had likely met his end, but there was no satisfaction in it. There was no justice, no answers to the questions that haunted him. What had driven Ilias to commit such a brutal act? Was it planned, or had it been a moment of uncontrollable rage? Daniel would never know. Weeks passed, then months. The case remained open, though with each passing day, the likelihood of finding Ilias, alive or dead, grew smaller. The community slowly returned to normal, though the fear lingered beneath the surface. Parents kept a closer watch on their children, doors were locked earlier, and trust in strangers became a thing of the past. Then in late 2004, a body was found. A fisherman discovered human remains tangled in the roots of a tree along the riverbank, miles downstream from where Ilias had jumped. The remains were unrecognizable, but a forensic examination confirmed the identity. Ilias was dead. For Daniel, the confirmation brought a sense of finality, though not peace. His daughter was still gone, and nothing could bring her back. The case that had begun with blood and horror had ended in the cold, indifferent embrace of the river. Life moved on, as it always did. But for those who had lived through the events of March 2004, the scars remained. Some wounds never truly heal. Story 2. In March 2004, Japan's criminal justice system faced significant scrutiny due to a high-profile case involving a Japanese researcher, Dr. Takashi Okamoto. Indicted in the United States on charges of industrial espionage, Dr. Okamoto's legal battle highlighted the complexities of international law and the challenges inherent in extradition proceedings. Dr. Okamoto, a respected medical researcher specializing in Alzheimer's disease, had previously worked at a research facility in Cleveland, Ohio. In May 2001, U.S. authorities indicted him, alleging that he had stolen valuable genetic materials from the laboratory. The indictment accused him of misappropriating proprietary research, a serious offense under U.S. law. The situation escalated when, nearly 2 years after the indictment, the United States formally requested Dr. Okamoto's extradition. In response, Japanese authorities detained him on February 2, 2004, as the Tokyo High Court began deliberations on the extradition request. This marked a pivotal moment, as it was the first time Japan had faced such a request from the U.S. since their bilateral extradition treaty came into effect in 1980. Throughout the proceedings, Dr. Okamoto maintained his innocence. He asserted that the materials in question were his property and lacked proprietary value, thereby negating any criminal intent. His defense emphasized that his actions did not constitute a crime under Japanese law, which does not have specific statutes addressing industrial espionage. On March 29, 2004, the Tokyo High Court delivered its verdict, denying the U.S. extradition request and ordering Dr. Okamoto's release from detention. The court concluded that his actions did not align with theft or destruction of property offenses, as defined under Japanese law. This decision underscored the legal principle that for extradition to be granted, the alleged offense must be recognized as a crime in both the requesting and requested countries, a concept known as dual criminality. The court's ruling had significant implications. It highlighted the differences between Japanese and U.S. legal frameworks, particularly concerning intellectual property and industrial espionage. Moreover, it underscored Japan's cautious approach to extraditing its citizens, especially when the alleged offenses are not clearly defined as crimes within its own legal system. This case marked the first instance in which Japan rejected a U.S. extradition request since the 1980 treaty's implementation. Historically, Japan had extradited 31 individuals to the United States under this treaty, including 8 Japanese nationals. The government's policy has been to extradite its citizens only if the alleged acts are illegal under Japanese law. The Dr. Okamoto case sparked discussions about the need for Japan to re-evaluate its legal provisions concerning industrial espionage. It also highlighted the challenges that arise in international collaborations, where differing legal standards can lead to complex legal disputes. As globalization continues to advance, such cases underscore the importance of harmonizing legal frameworks to address transnational crimes effectively. In the aftermath, Dr. Okamoto expressed relief at the court's decision, reiterating his stance that he had not violated any laws. The case served as a landmark in Japan's legal history, illustrating the intricate balance between upholding national legal principles and fulfilling international obligations. The aftermath of the Tokyo High Court's decision on March 29, 2004, sparked a wave of reactions from both Japan and the United States. The ruling was not merely a legal outcome. It was a statement on the complexities of international law and the limitations of bilateral agreements. The U.S. Justice Department expressed deep disappointment, arguing that the refusal to extradite Dr. Takashi Okamoto set a troubling precedent for future cases of industrial espionage involving multinational research collaborations. Officials in Washington feared that this decision might encourage further theft of intellectual property, particularly in fields where cutting-edge research had significant commercial and medical implications. In Japan, however, the ruling was viewed differently. Legal scholars pointed out that Japan's decision was consistent with its long-standing approach to extradition, which requires dual criminality for an extradition request to be honored. Since Japan had no specific laws categorizing industrial espionage as a crime, there was no legal basis for Dr. Okamoto's extradition. Many legal analysts argued that if Japan had agreed to the U.S. request, it would have set a dangerous precedent for allowing foreign legal standards to override domestic laws. Dr. Okamoto, upon his release, immediately addressed the media. He maintained his innocence, reiterating that the materials he had taken were his own research findings and not proprietary to the American laboratory where he had previously worked. He insisted that his intention was never to profit from stolen data, but rather to continue his scientific work in Japan. His supporters, including former colleagues and some members of Japan's scientific community, echoed his defense, stating that his contributions to Alzheimer's research were legitimate and that his prosecution had more to do with competitive pressures in the pharmaceutical industry than actual criminal wrongdoing. Despite his release, Dr. Okamoto's professional reputation had suffered irreparable damage. Many research institutions hesitated to associate with him, fearing controversy. While he had previously held a promising career in neurobiology, his arrest and legal battle had tainted his standing in the international scientific community. Although some universities in Japan expressed willingness to let him continue his research, none openly offered him a permanent position. Beyond the personal ramifications for Dr. Okamoto, the case forced Japan's legal and political institutions to re-examine their stance on international industrial espionage. Government officials debated whether existing laws provided adequate protection for proprietary research, and whether reforms were needed to address the growing concerns about intellectual property theft. Several members of Japan's National Diet called for discussions on updating the country's legal framework to prevent similar legal conflicts in the future. Meanwhile, in the United States, pressure mounted to revisit the extradition treaty with Japan. Some policymakers called for revisions that would allow greater flexibility in cases involving intellectual property and economic crimes. However, others cautioned that pushing for changes might strain U.S.-Japan relations, which were crucial in areas such as trade, defense, and technological cooperation. The refusal to extradite Dr. Okamoto was not the first time legal differences between the two nations had caused friction, and American officials were well aware that any attempt to renegotiate the treaty would require delicate diplomatic maneuvering. Public reaction in Japan was mixed. While some citizens believed Dr. Okamoto had been unfairly targeted and victimized by an aggressive foreign legal system, others felt that his case exposed weaknesses in Japan's handling of intellectual property disputes. Corporate leaders, in particular, raised concerns that Japan's lack of stringent industrial espionage laws could make it a haven for individuals looking to exploit legal loopholes. In a world where research and development played a critical role in economic power, ensuring the protection of proprietary data became a growing concern for Japanese companies and universities. As the legal dust settled, the implications of the case continued to ripple across both nations. The U.S. government was left grappling with how to handle future cases involving American research institutions and foreign scientists. Japan, on the other hand, had to consider whether its legal framework was sufficient to address the increasing complexities of international intellectual property conflicts. Though the case was officially closed, it remained a subject of debate in legal, political, and scientific circles for years to come. As months passed, the case of Dr. Takashi Okamoto continued to fuel discussions on both sides of the Pacific. While the Tokyo High Court had made its ruling clear, the controversy surrounding industrial espionage, intellectual property laws, and the broader implications of scientific research theft had only intensified. For Japan, the case raised an uncomfortable question. Was the country too lenient when it came to protecting sensitive research? For the United States, it was a frustrating reminder that even strong international alliances did not always result in legal cooperation. In Japan, the business and academic communities were divided. Some corporate leaders feared that the court's decision could embolden researchers to take proprietary data without fear of consequences. They worried that Japan's legal system might be seen as a safe haven for individuals looking to exploit loopholes in industrial espionage laws. In an age where scientific advancements were increasingly driving national economies, ensuring the protection of research and development was of paramount importance. On the other hand, many academics, particularly in public research institutions, argued that the U.S. had overstepped its bounds in attempting to criminalize Dr. Okamoto's actions. Some professors and researchers saw the case as an example of a powerful foreign government using its legal system to police scientific activities beyond its borders. They felt that the pressure to extradite Okamoto had been motivated less by justice and more by the pharmaceutical industry's desire to control the global market for Alzheimer's research. Meanwhile, Dr. Okamoto himself remained in a difficult position. Although he had escaped extradition and imprisonment in the U.S., he was far from exonerated in the court of public opinion. Many universities in Japan hesitated to associate with him, fearing that any affiliation might bring international scrutiny. Research institutions, especially those with partnerships abroad, were wary of hiring a scientist whose name had become synonymous with legal controversy. Despite his insistence on his innocence, the shadow of suspicion followed him wherever he went. Desperate to continue his work, Okamoto attempted to rebuild his career through independent research. He sought grants from private institutions and collaborated with smaller universities that were less concerned about public relations. However, the damage had been done. The stigma attached to his name made it nearly impossible for him to regain his former standing in the scientific community. Where once he had been a respected researcher with promising breakthroughs, he was now viewed as a cautionary tale. A man whose career had been derailed by a legal battle that blurred the lines between ethics, law, and international diplomacy. In the United States, the failure to extradite Okamoto led to calls for a re-evaluation of intellectual property laws and extradition agreements. Some U.S. lawmakers pushed for stricter regulations governing foreign researchers working in American labs, arguing that greater oversight was needed to prevent similar incidents in the future. Others proposed revising the extradition treaty with Japan to close the loophole that had allowed Okamoto to avoid prosecution. However, renegotiating such a treaty was not a simple task. Japan was unlikely to agree to any revisions that compromised its sovereignty or forced it to adopt American legal definitions of industrial espionage. Despite the legal and political turmoil, the scientific community continued its research, with or without Okamoto. The Alzheimer's studies he had been involved in moved forward, with other researchers picking up where he had left off. If there had been any hope that his discoveries would be remembered for their contributions to medicine, they were now overshadowed by the controversy surrounding his legal battle. By the end of 2004, the case had largely faded from the headlines, but its impact lingered. The Okamoto affair had exposed critical gaps in international legal cooperation, highlighting the challenges of prosecuting intellectual property crimes across borders. It had also forced Japan to confront its outdated industrial espionage laws, though whether meaningful reforms would be made remained uncertain. For Okamoto, life after the trial was a quiet one. He withdrew from public view, focusing on what little research he could conduct on his own. Some say he moved to a small town in northern Japan, where he lived in relative obscurity, far removed from the world of cutting-edge science that had once defined his life. But even in his absence, the questions his case had raised remained unanswered. In an era of rapid scientific advancements, who truly owned knowledge? Where did the line between research collaboration and intellectual property theft lie? And perhaps most importantly, what price should a person pay for pushing those boundaries? These were the questions left behind by the events of March 2004. Questions that neither Japan nor the United States could easily resolve. Story 3. In March 2004, a tragic event unfolded in Seminole County, Oklahoma, that would leave a lasting impact on the community. In the early hours of March 2nd, David Bryan Magnan, accompanied by 2 other men, arrived at the home of James Howard, a member of the Seminole Nation. The residence had been the site of a birthday celebration the previous evening, and as the festivities died down, the household settled into sleep, unaware of the impending danger. Magnan, armed with a pistol, confronted an individual outside the house, leading to a physical altercation during which he shot the person in the abdomen. This violent encounter was only the beginning of a horrific sequence of events. Magnan then entered the home, where he found James Howard asleep. Without hesitation, he shot Howard multiple times in the chest, ending his life instantly. The violence did not stop there. Magnan proceeded to a bedroom where Karen Wolfe and Lucilla McGirt, also members of the Seminole Nation, were sleeping. He shot Wolfe in the head, killing her instantly. McGirt was shot in the shoulder and head. Despite her grievous injuries, she survived long enough to identify Magnan as the shooter before succumbing to her wounds 2 weeks later. Following the shootings, Magnan and his accomplices fled the scene, attempting to conceal their involvement by hiding the murder weapon. However, law enforcement agencies, including the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, the Seminole County Sheriff's Office, the Seminole Nation Lighthorse Police, and the FBI, collaborated in a thorough investigation. Their efforts led to the recovery of the hidden firearm and the eventual apprehension of Magnan. The community was left in shock and mourning. The brutal nature of the crimes, coupled with the loss of 3 respected members of the Seminole Nation, cast a pall over the area. Vigils were held, and support poured in for the families of the victims. The senselessness of the violence left many grappling for answers, as the tight-knit community struggled to come to terms with the tragedy. As the legal proceedings began, the case drew significant attention, not only due to the heinousness of the crimes, but also because it highlighted issues related to violence in Native American communities and the jurisdictional complexities that often arise in such cases. The collaboration between federal and local agencies underscored the importance of cooperative efforts in the pursuit of justice. The trial of David Bryan Magnin was set to become a focal point for discussions on criminal justice, community healing, and the systemic challenges faced by indigenous populations in the United States. As the community braced for the legal battles ahead, the memory of James Howard, Karen Wolfe, and Lucilla McGirt remained at the forefront, serving as a poignant reminder of the lives lost and the enduring impact of that fateful night in March 2004. As the investigation into the brutal murders of James Howard, Karen Wolfe, and Lucilla McGirt unfolded, law enforcement agencies worked tirelessly to build a case against David Bryan Magnin. The small community of Seminole County was still in shock, struggling to comprehend the senseless violence that had shattered families and left an indelible scar on the region. While authorities moved swiftly to gather evidence, the victims' loved ones mourned in silence, grappling with the weight of their grief. The crime scene itself was a harrowing testament to the brutality of the attack. Blood stained the walls and floors, bullet casings lay scattered throughout the house, and the eerie silence of a home once filled with life now felt suffocating. Investigators meticulously documented every detail, knowing that even the smallest piece of evidence could be crucial in securing a conviction. Witness statements, forensic analysis, and ballistics reports all pointed to one undeniable conclusion. Magnin had deliberately executed his victims with calculated intent. One of the key pieces of evidence came from the dying declaration of Lucilla McGirt. Despite suffering from multiple gunshot wounds, she had managed to hold on to life long enough to name Magnin as the shooter. Her testimony, given in her final moments, carried significant legal weight, as statements made by a victim on their deathbed are often considered irrefutable in a court of law. Investigators recorded her words carefully, ensuring that her voice would be heard even after her passing. In addition to McGirt's statement, law enforcement recovered the murder weapon, which had been hidden in a wooded area several miles from the crime scene. The gun, a .40 caliber pistol, matched the ballistics of the bullets retrieved from the victims' bodies. Further forensic testing revealed Magnin's fingerprints on the firearm, eliminating any doubt about his involvement. Magnin, meanwhile, showed no remorse for his actions. Following his arrest, he was uncooperative with authorities, refusing to provide any explanation for his crimes. His accomplices, who had initially aided in his escape, quickly turned on him in exchange for reduced sentences. Under police questioning, they described the night of the murders in chilling detail, painting a picture of a man fueled by rage and a sense of vengeance. Court documents later revealed that Magnin had a history of violent behavior. He had been in and out of jail for various offenses, including assault and drug-related charges. Some believed that his actions on the night of March 2, 2004, were the culmination of years of unchecked aggression, while others speculated that the attack had been motivated by personal vendettas. Rumors swirled that Magnin had a long-standing dispute with one of the victims, though no definitive motive was ever established. The prosecution built its case with meticulous precision, knowing that the weight of justice rested on their ability to secure a conviction. Given the severity of the crime, prosecutors pursued the death penalty, arguing that Magnin's cold-blooded actions warranted the harshest possible punishment. The defense, on the other hand, attempted to paint Magnin as a man with a troubled past, seeking to shift some of the blame onto his upbringing and history of substance abuse. As the trial date approached, tensions in the community continued to rise. Many residents of Seminole County saw the case as a crucial test of the justice system's ability to hold violent offenders accountable. Families of the victims attended every hearing, their faces marked with grief and determination. They wanted to ensure that their loved ones did not die in vain, and that the man responsible would face the full consequences of his actions. In the months leading up to the trial, legal experts debated the complexities of the case. Some pointed out that the involvement of Native American victims added a layer of jurisdictional challenges, as crimes involving indigenous individuals often fell under both state and federal law. However, given the severity of the offense, there was little doubt that Magnin would be prosecuted to the fullest extent possible. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Magnin remained defiant. He showed no emotion during court proceedings, refusing to acknowledge the pain he had caused. His lack of remorse only fueled the anger of the victims' families, who saw his indifference as further proof of his guilt. As the trial loomed closer, the community braced itself for the final chapter in a case that had already left an unforgettable mark on their lives. The weight of justice was heavy, and for the families of James Howard, Karen Wolf, and Lucilla McGirt, closure could only come in one form: a guilty verdict. The trial of David Brian Magnan began in late 2004, drawing the attention of legal experts, journalists, and community members alike. For months, the case had been a source of grief and unrest in Seminole County, but now, the time had come for justice to be served. The courtroom was packed on the first day of the trial, with the families of the victims seated in the front rows, their eyes fixed on the man who had torn their lives apart. The prosecution wasted no time in laying out their case. They presented overwhelming evidence: ballistics reports, forensic findings, witness testimonies, and most damning of all, the dying declaration of Lucilla McGirt. Her final words, spoken in the presence of law enforcement, carried the weight of undeniable truth. "It was Magnan," she had whispered before succumbing to her injuries, and that statement alone was a powerful blow to the defense. In addition, the prosecution played audio recordings from police interrogations of Magnan's accomplices, who described in chilling detail how the murders unfolded. They recounted how Magnan had fired mercilessly into the home, how he had stood over his victims with no hesitation, and how he had later discarded the weapon in an attempt to cover his tracks. Their willingness to testify against him came in exchange for lighter sentences, but their statements were corroborated by the physical evidence, leaving little room for doubt. The defense struggled to present an alternative narrative. They argued that Magnan had been intoxicated on the night of the murders, suggesting that he had not been fully in control of his actions. They also attempted to claim that he had been provoked, though they failed to provide substantial evidence to support this assertion. At one point, they even tried to cast doubt on the credibility of McGirt's dying declaration, but the judge quickly dismissed these arguments, ruling that her statement was legally admissible and highly compelling. As the weeks passed, witness after witness took the stand, each testimony painting a grim picture of the events that transpired on March 2, 2004. Family members of the victims shared heartbreaking accounts of the impact these murders had on their lives. James Howard's mother described how her son had been the pillar of their family, a man known for his kindness and generosity. Karen Wolf's sister spoke through tears about how Karen had been a devoted mother, leaving behind children who would never see her again. By the time the prosecution rested its case, the weight of the evidence was staggering. The jury, comprised of individuals from both native and non-native backgrounds, listened intently, their expressions betraying the emotional toll of hearing such horrific details. When it was time for the defense to present its case, it was clear they had little to offer in Magnan's favor. He refused to take the stand, likely upon the advice of his attorneys, who knew that any testimony from him could further incriminate him. His past criminal record, while not directly admissible as evidence, was well known within the community. Many saw him as a violent man who had finally gone too far, and the defense's weak arguments did little to sway public opinion. After closing arguments, the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with their verdict. The courtroom fell silent as the judge read the decision, guilty on all counts. The families of the victims held on to one another, some weeping, others nodding in solemn relief. Justice, at least in the legal sense, had been served. When it came time for sentencing, the prosecution pushed for the death penalty, arguing that the sheer brutality of the crime warranted the harshest punishment available under the law. The defense, in a final effort to save Magnan's life, pleaded for life in prison without parole. Ultimately, the judge handed down the death sentence, stating that the premeditated nature of the murders and Magnan's utter lack of remorse left no room for leniency. For the families of James Howard, Karen Wolf, and Lucilla McGirt, the verdict brought a measure of closure, but the pain of their loss would never fully heal. They had fought tirelessly to see justice carried out, attending every court hearing, reliving the trauma of that night over and over again. Now they could finally begin the long and difficult process of moving forward. The case of David Brian Magnan became a landmark moment in Oklahoma's legal history, shedding light on the ongoing issues of violence in Native American communities and the jurisdictional complexities that often arise in such cases. It also reinforced the importance of interagency cooperation, as the combined efforts of the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, the Seminole County Sheriff's Office, the Seminole Nation Lighthorse Police, and the FBI had been instrumental in bringing Magnan to justice. Years later, the case continued to be referenced in discussions about violent crime and the challenges of prosecuting cases that involve both state and federal jurisdictions. While Magnan remained on death row, awaiting his final fate, the families of his victims carried on with their lives, forever changed by the events of that tragic night in March 2004. Though time moved forward, the memories of James Howard, Karen Wolfe, and Lucilla McGirt lived on. Their names were spoken in prayers, their faces remembered in photographs, their stories passed down to ensure they would never be forgotten. In the end, the justice system had done its part, but no verdict or sentence could ever undo the irreversible pain caused by one man's senseless act of violence. Story 4. In April 2004, a significant legal battle unfolded in the United States, centering on the case of an Amish man named Daniel Zier. This case brought to light the complex interplay between religious freedom and federal regulations, challenging the boundaries of constitutional rights in the context of national security. Daniel Zier, a Canadian citizen and member of an Old Order Amish community, adhered strictly to his faith's prohibition against graven images, interpreting it as a ban on being photographed. In June 2001, Zier entered the United States and married Ruth Ann, settling in Licking Township, Clarion County, Pennsylvania. The couple established a life deeply rooted in Amish traditions, eschewing modern conveniences and maintaining a lifestyle centered around their religious beliefs. In December 2003, Zier traveled to Canada to visit his ailing father. Upon attempting to return to the United States in January 2004, he was stopped at the border. Border officials informed Zier that he had self-deported and could not re-enter the country without proper identification, specifically a photo ID. Zier's religious convictions prevented him from complying with this requirement, leading to a legal impasse. The crux of the issue lay in the federal regulations mandating photographic identification for individuals seeking legal residence in the United States. The Department of Homeland Security emphasized the necessity of photographs for conducting thorough background checks, asserting that such measures were crucial for national security. Zier, however, proposed an alternative. He was willing to be fingerprinted, arguing that fingerprints provided a reliable means of identification without violating his religious beliefs. Federal prosecutors rejected Zier's proposal, maintaining that a photograph was indispensable for identity verification processes. In response, Zier filed a lawsuit, contending that the photo requirement infringed upon his First Amendment right to religious freedom. This legal action was particularly noteworthy, given the Amish community's general aversion to litigation and confrontation. Zier's decision to pursue legal recourse underscored the profound significance of the issue at hand. The case garnered national attention, sparking debates about the balance between religious liberties and governmental regulations. Legal scholars and civil rights advocates weighed in, discussing the potential implications of the case for religious minorities and the extent to which the government could impose requirements that conflict with individual beliefs. As of April 2004, the case was pending, with both sides preparing to present their arguments in court. The outcome had the potential to set a precedent for how religious freedoms are accommodated within the framework of federal regulations, particularly in matters related to identification and national security. Daniel Zier's legal battle highlighted the ongoing tension between individual rights and collective security, a theme that resonates deeply within the American legal and cultural landscape. The case served as a poignant reminder of the challenges inherent in upholding constitutional freedoms while ensuring the safety and integrity of the nation's borders. As the case of Daniel Zier continued to unfold, the stakes grew higher, not just for him, but for the broader Amish community and other religious groups who adhered to similar beliefs. The issue at hand was more than just a matter of one man's refusal to be photographed. It was a legal battle that posed serious questions about the nature of religious freedom, its limitations, and the power of the federal government to enforce national security measures. At the heart of the case was the First Amendment, which guarantees religious freedom, and the 14th Amendment, which ensures equal protection under the law. Zier's legal team argued that forcing him to provide a photo ID violated these constitutional rights. They contended that the government's insistence on a photograph infringed upon Zier's deeply held religious beliefs, which forbade the use of images for religious and cultural reasons. For Zier and his community, having their picture taken was seen as an act of vanity, which contradicted their core belief in humility and modesty. This belief wasn't just personal, it was a religious tenet passed down through generations. Federal authorities, on the other hand, took a firm stance on the issue, citing national security concerns and the need for all citizens and residents to adhere to standardized identification procedures. In a post-9/11 world, the U.S. government was especially vigilant about controlling immigration and ensuring that every individual entering or residing in the country was properly identified. Border officials and representatives from the Department of Homeland Security made it clear that the photo requirement was not arbitrary, but rather an essential element of a secure immigration system. They argued that photographs were necessary for the thorough background checks required to ensure the safety of the American public. Without this, they contended, it would be impossible to conduct accurate biometric screenings or confirm an individual's identity when they entered or exited the country. Zier's case quickly became a legal and political flashpoint. Legal analysts and civil liberties groups weighed in, drawing attention to the intersection of religious rights and public safety. While the U.S. government had a compelling interest in safeguarding the nation, it was also bound by constitutional limits when it came to infringing on the rights of its citizens, including religious freedoms. The Amish, one of the most well-known religious groups in America, had long been afforded certain accommodations due to their pacifist beliefs and rejection of modern technology. This case would test the boundaries of those accommodations. Public reaction was divided. Many Americans were sympathetic to Zier's religious convictions, seeing his refusal to be photographed as an expression of deep faith and commitment to his beliefs. They argued that the government could easily accommodate him through alternative forms of identification, such as fingerprinting, which Zier had already offered. For them, the case wasn't just about a single man. It represented a broader issue of how America could uphold its values of religious liberty and tolerance in an increasingly security-conscious world. On the other hand, some critics believed that Zier's refusal was an unreasonable challenge to a lawful system that was designed to protect the country. In their view, the photo requirement was a necessary safeguard that allowed the government to track individuals who entered the country and to ensure that proper vetting was done. They argued that the safety of the country should take precedence over individual religious beliefs, especially when it came to issues like immigration and national security. Some saw Zier's stance as a form of religious exemption that undermined the security of the nation as a whole. As Zier's legal team prepared for trial, they knew they were facing an uphill battle. They had to not only convince the judge and jury that their client's religious rights had been violated, but also address the pressing concerns about national security. It was a delicate balancing act, one that required not only legal arguments but a deep understanding of religious freedoms and how they could coexist with the practical realities of living in a modern, security-conscious society. The Amish community, which had generally avoided involvement in the public sphere and kept to itself, found itself thrust into the spotlight. Local Amish leaders expressed concern that the case would set a precedent that could affect other members of their faith who might one day face similar legal challenges. The larger Amish population, while largely silent during the legal proceedings, was quietly observing, concerned about how this case would impact their way of life. For them, the case represented more than just a legal question. It was about preserving the integrity of their religious practices in the face of growing pressure from the outside world. Meanwhile, Daniel Zier's personal life was in turmoil. As a man caught between two worlds, one defined by his deep faith and the other by the demands of modern society, he felt increasingly isolated. He missed his wife Ruth Ann, who had remained in Pennsylvania while he dealt with the legal battle. His children, too young to fully understand the complexities of the case, had been forced to grow up in the shadow of the ongoing controversy. Zier's quiet resolve to adhere to his religious convictions, despite the personal and familial cost, only underscored the depth of his commitment to his faith. Despite the mounting pressure, Zier remained steadfast in his refusal to comply with the government's demands. He understood that his stance might not only affect his own life, but could also set a precedent for how future religious disputes were handled in the U.S. As the case moved closer to trial, it became clear that its outcome would shape the future of religious freedoms and the government's role in regulating them. Would the government's interest in security outweigh the individual's right to practice their faith? Or would religious freedoms be upheld, even when they clashed with national security requirements? The coming weeks promised to be pivotal in determining the future of religious accommodations in the United States, with Daniel Zier at the center of the debate. The outcome of his case had the potential to influence legal decisions for years to come, setting a precedent for how the courts balance the fundamental right to religious liberty with the growing need for national security. As the case progressed, the legal arguments grew increasingly complex. The courtroom became a battleground for competing interests. On one side, the U.S. government's imperative to ensure national security through comprehensive identification systems, and on the other, Zier's unwavering commitment to his religious beliefs and his interpretation of the First Amendment. Daniel Zier's legal team continued to focus on presenting a strong case for religious accommodation. They argued that the Amish community had a long history of receiving certain exemptions from societal norms, including exemptions from military service, voting, and other activities that conflicted with their religious teachings. This history of accommodation, they contended, should extend to the issue of identification, particularly when the government already had other means of verifying an individual's identity. They argued that fingerprinting, a method Zier was more than willing to undergo, could serve as an equally effective, if not more accurate, means of identification. The prosecution, on the other hand, insisted that the photo requirement was an essential part of the government's efforts to maintain security. In a post-9/11 world, they argued, the need for secure and standardized identification was paramount. The government's position was that the ability to photograph and track individuals who entered and exited the country was vital to keeping Americans safe. The government's interest in protecting its citizens, they argued, far outweighed the individual's claim to religious exemption in this particular case. They pointed out that Zier's refusal to provide a photograph was not just a minor issue. It was a deliberate challenge to a system designed to protect the nation. In their eyes, the photo requirement wasn't merely an inconvenience. It was an integral part of a broader effort to secure the U.S. border and track potential threats. As the trial continued, public opinion remained divided. Religious organizations and civil rights groups rallied behind Zier, seeing the case as a test of the U.S. government's respect for religious freedoms. They pointed to the historical precedents of religious exemptions in American law, arguing that forcing Zier to comply with the photo requirement would set a dangerous precedent for the erosion of religious liberties. The government, they claimed, was overstepping its bounds by demanding that an individual violate deeply held religious convictions in the name of security. However, those who supported the government's stance felt that the photo requirement was a necessary step in ensuring that the U.S. could continue to function as a secure nation. They feared that granting Zier the religious exemption he requested would set a troubling precedent, potentially opening the door for other individuals to claim exemptions from legal requirements on the basis of personal or religious beliefs. While they recognized Zier's sincerity, they felt that the need for national security should take precedence in this case. Amid this growing tension, the case began to attract more national attention. Legal scholars debated its implications, and the media followed the developments closely, covering every detail of the trial. For many, it was more than just a legal case. It was a discussion about the very nature of American identity, the boundaries of religious freedom, and how those boundaries should be drawn in the face of modern challenges. Finally, after weeks of hearings and deliberations, the case reached its final stages. The judge presiding over the case, who had spent considerable time reviewing both the legal arguments and the broader societal context, was faced with the difficult task of determining how to balance the competing interests at play. The issue of religious accommodation had been argued in various courts before, but this case was different. It was a case where religious beliefs directly collided with national security concerns. The judge would have to consider not only the constitutional protections afforded to Zier, but also the potential consequences for national security if religious exemptions were granted. In the final moments of the trial, both sides presented their closing arguments. Zier's attorney emphasized the long-standing history of religious exemptions in the U.S. and argued that no one should be forced to choose between their faith and their country. They reiterated that Zier was willing to comply with the government's identification procedures through fingerprinting, a method that could easily verify his identity without violating his religious beliefs. The government's attorney, meanwhile, reiterated the importance of the photo ID requirement. They argued that the world had changed since 9/11, and the need for heightened security had never been greater. While they expressed respect for Zier's religious beliefs, they contended that allowing him to bypass the photo requirement would undermine the nation's security measures. The government's case was built on the assertion that the greater good of the country must prevail over individual exemptions. The judge, who had been meticulously weighing the arguments, ultimately ruled in favor of the government. While acknowledging Zier's deeply held religious beliefs, the judge determined that the federal government's interest in national security and immigration control was paramount. The decision was controversial, and it sparked heated debates across the country. In his ruling, the judge emphasized the need for the government to ensure security at all costs, especially in an age where terrorism and illegal immigration were significant concerns. He argued that the photo ID requirement was a minimal burden to place on individuals, especially considering the safety it provided to the nation. The ruling left many disappointed, especially within the Amish community, who had hoped for a more accommodating decision. Zier, while disheartened, accepted the decision with a heavy heart. For him, it was not just a legal defeat, it was a blow to his ability to fully live out his faith in the modern world. But the ruling also brought a sense of finality, and while it did not resolve the broader issues of religious accommodation and national security, it set a legal precedent for how similar cases would be handled in the future. The case of Daniel Zier highlighted the delicate balance between individual freedoms and the collective security of the nation. It was a reminder that, in a world where threats were becoming more complex and pervasive, the courts would be called upon to make difficult decisions that weighed the interests of individuals against the needs of society as a whole. Though Zier's case did not result in a legal victory, it left a lasting impact on how the law would approach religious freedoms in the face of national security concerns, shaping the future of similar cases for years to come. Story 5. In April 2004, Australia was confronted with a case that would challenge its legal system and ignite discussions on the rights of transgender individuals. The case, known as Alex, involved a 13-year-old adolescent named Alex, who sought hormonal treatment to affirm his male gender identity. Alex, a ward of the state of Victoria, had been diagnosed with gender identity disorder, a condition where an individual's gender identity differs from the sex assigned at birth. The central issue was whether the Family Court of Australia, or the Victorian State Government Department, responsible for Alex's care, should authorize medical treatment involving hormonal therapies to assist Alex in developing secondary sexual characteristics aligned with his affirmed maleness. The case highlighted the complexities of medical ethics, legal authority, and the rights of minors in making decisions about their health care. It underscored the necessity for a nuanced approach to medical treatment for transgender adolescents, balancing the need for timely intervention with the protection of vulnerable individuals. The decision in Alex set a significant precedent in Australian law, affirming the rights of transgender minors to access medical treatments that align with their gender identity. It also prompted broader discussions on the recognition and support of transgender individuals within Australian society. This case remains a pivotal moment in the ongoing dialogue about transgender rights and healthcare in Australia, reflecting the nation's evolving understanding and acceptance of gender diversity. The complexities surrounding the case of Alex were numerous, touching on issues of medical ethics, legal precedents, and the rights of minors. Alex, born female, had identified as male for several years prior to seeking treatment. His decision to pursue hormone therapy was not taken lightly. It came after careful consideration with his family and medical professionals. However, Alex's status as a ward of the state, under the care of the Victorian Department of Human Services, meant that the legal framework for decision-making on his behalf was particularly complicated. At the heart of the case was a fundamental question: should a child, particularly one as young as Alex, have the right to make such a significant and life-altering decision? The answer to this question involved balancing a number of interests, including Alex's autonomy over his own body, the medical community's understanding of gender dysphoria, and the state's duty to protect vulnerable minors. For Alex, this decision was not just about the medical treatments he sought, but about living an authentic life. His desire to transition and receive hormone therapy was supported by a medical team of experts in gender identity and adolescent care, who affirmed that early intervention was crucial to reducing the risks of severe psychological distress and the potential for gender dysphoria to intensify with age. They argued that by preventing the onset of puberty or delaying the development of female secondary sexual characteristics, Alex would have the opportunity to fully explore his gender identity in a safe and supportive environment, without the added burden of body changes that would create even more confusion and discomfort. Yet, the family court's involvement raised questions of whether a court, rather than the individual or their family, should make the final decision about such treatments. The Family Court of Australia was tasked with determining if Alex's medical care fell within the scope of the state's protection over his welfare, as he was a minor under its care. The court had to decide if authorizing medical treatment would be in Alex's best interests, and whether the treatment was considered to be in line with the best practices for adolescent healthcare. The opposition in the case came from those who argued that transgender hormone therapy for a minor, especially one as young as Alex, should not be approved without a greater level of scrutiny and a more extensive understanding of the long-term effects of such treatments. Concerns were raised regarding the irreversible nature of certain aspects of hormone therapy and the possibility of regret later in life. These opponents also questioned the ability of a 13-year-old to fully comprehend the consequences of transitioning at such a young age, especially when the medical community itself was still grappling with the complexities of gender transition and its full implications. The state of Victoria's Department of Human Services, as the guardian of Alex's well-being, initially opposed the hormone treatment. They argued that a decision of such magnitude should be delayed until Alex reached a more mature age, better equipped to make decisions regarding his gender identity. This stance reflected broader societal concerns about whether minors should be allowed to make such serious and irreversible decisions about their bodies. Despite these concerns, medical professionals, including gender specialists and pediatric endocrinologists, strongly advocated for early intervention. They highlighted the importance of allowing Alex to undergo puberty in a way that aligned with his gender identity. Delaying such treatment could increase the risk of psychological harm, they argued, as Alex would be forced to live through the physical changes of puberty that conflicted with his inner sense of self. They also noted that if intervention was delayed, it could make the transition more complicated in the future, with potential irreversible damage to Alex's mental and emotional health. The court proceedings were closely followed by the Australian public and the medical community, as the case had broader implications for the treatment of transgender minors in Australia. It prompted many to reflect on the nature of informed consent, especially when it came to adolescence. How much autonomy should a minor have over decisions regarding their body? How much weight should be placed on the medical advice provided by experts in the field? These questions were central not only to Alex's case, but to the future treatment of transgender youth in Australia and around the world. In a landmark ruling, the Family Court of Australia ultimately decided in Alex's favor. The court acknowledged the critical role that early intervention could play in supporting transgender youth and affirmed that Alex's desire to transition was not only valid, but deserving of legal and medical recognition. The decision marked a significant shift in how Australian law would approach transgender rights, particularly the rights of transgender minors to access gender-affirming healthcare. In the judgment, the court emphasized the importance of protecting Alex's well-being by allowing him access to hormone therapy. The judge recognized that while the decision was complex and carried significant consequences, it was ultimately in Alex's best interests to begin the process of transitioning with the support of his family and medical professionals. The court also made it clear that its decision was based on a comprehensive understanding of the medical, psychological, and social dimensions of gender dysphoria, and that it had considered the long-term implications of Alex's transition in a careful and thoughtful manner. While the ruling was a victory for Alex and the growing movement for transgender rights in Australia, it was also a contentious one. Critics of the decision, including some in the medical field, voiced concerns about the potential risks of allowing minors to undergo hormone therapy. Others feared that the case could set a precedent for other minors seeking similar treatments, without fully understanding the complexities of such decisions. Nevertheless, the case of Alex highlighted a fundamental shift in how gender identity was viewed within Australian society and the medical community. It raised questions about the intersection of law, medicine, and personal autonomy, and it pushed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable in terms of medical intervention for transgender minors. While the case itself was specific to Alex's circumstances, it had wider implications for how the rights of transgender individuals, especially youth, were understood and upheld in Australia. Ultimately, the Alex case became a landmark moment in the legal and medical landscape, serving as a key reference point for future cases involving transgender minors and gender-affirming care. It also sparked a broader conversation about the importance of providing transgender youth with the tools and support they needed to navigate their gender identity in a society that was only beginning to fully embrace gender diversity. The aftermath of the Alex case had far-reaching effects, both legally and socially, in Australia. The court's ruling set a significant legal precedent for how courts would handle similar cases involving transgender minors in the future. For the first time, the family court had explicitly acknowledged the importance of gender-affirming treatments, such as hormone therapy, and their role in helping transgender youth align their physical characteristics with their gender identity. This was seen as a victory not only for Alex, but for transgender rights more broadly, particularly in the context of the ongoing struggle for recognition and acceptance of transgender individuals in society. The ruling was widely regarded as a necessary step toward fostering a more inclusive and compassionate legal and medical system for transgender individuals. It sent a strong message that gender dysphoria was a legitimate medical condition and that transgender minors, like other individuals, should have the right to access appropriate health care to address their needs. The decision helped to normalize the idea that transgender youth should not have to wait until adulthood to begin their transition, as early intervention was proven to be critical for their mental and emotional well-being. Yet, the case also sparked significant controversy, particularly among those who remained deeply skeptical about the medical and legal implications of transitioning at such a young age. Many of these critics, including some conservative groups and individuals within the medical community, raised concerns about the long-term consequences of hormone therapy. They questioned whether young adolescents were capable of making such life-altering decisions and expressed concerns about potential regret later in life, especially given that the effects of hormone therapy are irreversible. These criticisms centered around the idea that minors may not have the maturity or capacity to fully understand the implications of transitioning. Some argued that gender identity could be fluid, and that adolescents might change their minds as they grew older. This fear of regret led some to advocate for a more cautious approach, one that involved greater waiting periods or more extensive psychological evaluations before any medical interventions were undertaken. For these opponents, the Alex case represented an overreach of both medical and legal authorities in the lives of vulnerable minors. Despite these concerns, many transgender advocacy groups and healthcare professionals pointed out that gender dysphoria could cause significant harm if left unaddressed, often leading to depression, anxiety, and suicidal thoughts. The earlier a transgender individual received treatment to align their physical appearance with their gender identity, the less likely they were to experience these harmful effects. Many argued that the focus should not be on the possibility of regret, but on the immediate well-being of the individual, whose suffering was often exacerbated by the mismatch between their gender identity and the physical changes of puberty. As the public debate continued, the case also brought to light the complexities of informed consent in the context of adolescent healthcare. Medical professionals specializing in transgender care pointed out that adolescents were capable of making informed decisions about their health with proper guidance and support. They emphasized the importance of involving parents, medical professionals, and mental health experts in the decision-making process to ensure that the adolescent's choice was well-informed and aligned with their long-term well-being. In this sense, Alex highlighted the need for a comprehensive, multidisciplinary approach to the care of transgender minors, one that took into account their psychological, emotional, and physical needs. In the years following the case, Australian law and medical practice regarding transgender healthcare continued to evolve. The family court's ruling in Alex was used as a foundation for subsequent cases involving transgender minors, and many medical professionals began to adopt a more open approach to gender-affirming care for adolescents. This marked a shift from the more traditional, conservative stance that had previously dominated discussions about transgender health and rights. One of the lasting legacies of the Alex case was the growing recognition of the importance of transgender youth in Australian society. The case helped to reduce the stigma surrounding transgender identity and created a platform for broader conversations about gender diversity. Schools, workplaces, and healthcare providers began to implement more inclusive policies, recognizing the unique challenges faced by transgender individuals, particularly youth. Support networks for transgender youth also grew, providing them with safe spaces to explore their gender identity and seek the support they needed to thrive. For Alex, the court's ruling was a pivotal moment in his journey, not just as an individual, but as a symbol of the broader fight for transgender rights. His case had sparked a national conversation, one that would ultimately lead to greater understanding and acceptance of transgender individuals in Australia. While the legal victory was significant, it was also the beginning of a broader societal shift that would continue to unfold in the years that followed. In the wake of the ruling, Alex received hormone therapy and began the process of transitioning, with the full support of his family and medical team. His journey was one of resilience and self-discovery, and he became an advocate for transgender rights, speaking out about his experience and the importance of early intervention for transgender youth. His case, while deeply personal, became a catalyst for change, sparking a movement that would continue to advocate for the rights and recognition of transgender individuals across Australia. As Alex grew older, he reflected on the case and its impact on his life. He recognized that the legal battles he had faced were not just about him, but about all transgender youth who sought to live authentically and without fear of discrimination. His experience, as painful and challenging as it was, ultimately contributed to a future in which transgender individuals could access the health care they needed without fear of being stigmatized or denied care. The legacy of Alex thus extended far beyond the courtroom. It helped to shape a more inclusive society, one in which transgender individuals were afforded the same rights, respect, and opportunities as anyone else. It was a case that highlighted the importance of supporting transgender youth, listening to their needs, and affirming their identities, ensuring that they could grow up in a world where their rights were recognized and protected. In this sense, Alex was not just a legal decision, it was a turning point in the ongoing fight for transgender equality, one that would continue to shape Australian society for years to come. It was a reminder that, even in the face of opposition and uncertainty, the rights of transgender individuals, particularly youth, must be safeguarded and their voices must be heard. Story 6. In May 2004, Thailand was rocked by a series of violent incidents in its southern provinces, particularly in Narathiwat, Pattani, and Yala. These events were part of a broader insurgency that had been escalating since early 2004, marked by coordinated attacks on police outposts, military installations, and civilian targets. On April 28, 2004, a significant attack occurred when over 100 militants launched simultaneous assaults on 10 police outposts across the 3 provinces. The attackers, heavily armed and well-coordinated, overwhelmed the police forces, leading to the deaths of several officers and the theft of weapons and ammunition. The audacity and scale of these attacks underscored the growing strength and organization of the insurgent groups operating in the region. Following these attacks, a group of militants sought refuge in the 16th century Kru Se Mosque in Pattani. The mosque, a revered site for Muslims in the region, became the focal point of a tense standoff between the insurgents and Thai security forces. Negotiations failed, and after a 7-hour siege, the Thai military launched an assault on the mosque. All 32 militants inside were killed, and the mosque suffered significant damage. The incident drew international criticism, with many questioning the necessity and proportionality of the military's response, especially given the mosque's cultural and religious significance. In the aftermath of the Kru Se Mosque incident, the Thai government declared a state of emergency in the southern provinces, granting security forces sweeping powers to combat the insurgency. This included the authority to detain suspects without charge and conduct searches without warrants. While intended to restore order, these measures led to allegations of human rights abuses, including arbitrary arrests, torture, and extrajudicial killings. The insurgency in southern Thailand is rooted in a complex mix of historical, political, and religious factors. The region has a significant Muslim Malay population that has long felt marginalized by the central Thai government, which is predominantly Buddhist. Decades of perceived neglect and discrimination have fueled separatist sentiments and calls for greater autonomy. The insurgent groups, often operating under the banner of the Barisan Revolusi Nasional, BRN, have employed guerrilla tactics, including bombings, assassinations, and ambushes, targeting both security forces and civilians. The Thai government's response has been multifaceted, involving military operations, political initiatives, and attempts at dialogue. However, the heavy-handed military approach has often been criticized for exacerbating tensions and alienating the local population. The lack of a comprehensive and inclusive strategy has hindered efforts to achieve lasting peace in the region. The events of April and May 2004 marked a significant escalation in the southern insurgency, leading to increased violence and instability. The Kru Se Mosque incident, in particular, highlighted the challenges of balancing security concerns with respect for cultural and religious sites. The government's subsequent actions, including the imposition of emergency laws and military crackdowns, have been subjects of ongoing debate, with many advocating for a more nuanced approach that addresses the root causes of the insurgency and promotes reconciliation. As the situation in southern Thailand continues to evolve, the lessons learned from the events of May 2004 remain pertinent. The need for a comprehensive strategy that combines security measures with political dialogue, respect for human rights, and efforts to address the underlying grievances of the local population is crucial for achieving a sustainable and peaceful resolution to the conflict. In the wake of the violence in southern Thailand in May 2004, the Thai government found itself in a precarious position. The insurgent attacks had not only undermined the government's authority in the southern provinces, but also highlighted the deeply rooted tensions between the state and the Muslim Malay population. Many in the local community viewed the actions of the military as heavy-handed, and the Crusade Mosque incident, in particular, sparked a wave of anger and frustration. The military's decision to storm the mosque, resulting in the deaths of militants and the destruction of the sacred site, became a symbol of the government's disregard for religious and cultural sensitivities. Critics argued that the government's approach, focused primarily on military operations and crackdowns, failed to address the root causes of the insurgency. The government's emphasis on a strong military response, combined with the declaration of a state of emergency in the region, alienated many moderate Muslims who felt caught between the insurgents and the state. The military's broad powers, granted under the state of emergency, included the ability to arrest individuals without charge, conduct warrantless searches, and detain suspects indefinitely. This led to reports of human rights abuses, including arbitrary arrests, torture, and extrajudicial killings. While these measures were intended to suppress the insurgency, they only fueled further resentment among the local population. The conflict in southern Thailand, particularly the violent incidents of April and May 2004, was not a new development. The insurgency had been simmering for decades, dating back to the 1940s, when the Thai government began asserting greater control over the Muslim-majority southern provinces. The history of the region is marked by a series of uprisings, protests, and violent clashes as local communities resisted perceived state-imposed policies that marginalized their culture, religion, and identity. Despite occasional efforts to address grievances through dialogue, the insurgency had only gained momentum in the early 2000s, with new, more radical groups emerging to challenge the government. For the insurgent groups, the attacks in May 2004 were seen as part of a larger struggle for autonomy and self-determination. They viewed the Thai state as an oppressive force, seeking to impose its authority over a region that had long been culturally and religiously distinct. The militants, many of whom were affiliated with the Barisan Revolusi Nasional, BRN, a separatist movement that had been active since the 1960s, believed that violence was the only way to achieve their objectives. The insurgents had begun employing more sophisticated tactics, including bombings, assassinations, and ambushes, targeting both military and civilian targets. Their goal was not only to disrupt the Thai state's control over the region, but also to send a message to the international community about the severity of the conflict. The Thai government, in turn, found itself caught in a difficult position. It was clear that the violence in the southern provinces was not simply a matter of isolated criminal activity, but a full-fledged insurgency, with deep political, social, and historical roots. However, the government struggled to balance its efforts to quell the insurgency with the need to maintain relationships with the local Muslim population. The indiscriminate use of force and the perceived lack of concern for local sensitivities only deepened the divide between the state and the people of the southern provinces. It became apparent that military force alone could not bring an end to the violence and instability in the region. In the aftermath of the violence, the government began to explore alternatives to its military-focused approach. There were calls from both domestic and international sources for a more comprehensive strategy that included political dialogue, economic development, and efforts to address the grievances of the local Muslim population. Many argued that the key to resolving the conflict lay in addressing the historical injustices faced by the people of the southern provinces, particularly the lack of political representation, economic opportunities, and cultural recognition. Without these fundamental changes, the cycle of violence would likely continue. International organizations, including human rights groups and United Nations agencies, also weighed in on the situation in southern Thailand. They called for an immediate end to human rights violations and for the government to engage in a genuine peace process with the insurgents. The Crusade Mosque incident, in particular, drew widespread condemnation from the international community, with many questioning whether the use of force was justified in such a sensitive context. The loss of life, including the deaths of civilians, raised difficult questions about the rules of engagement and the ethics of military intervention in conflict zones. Despite the calls for peace and dialogue, the violence in the South continued to escalate throughout the remainder of 2004 and beyond. In the months following the attacks in May, there were further incidents of bombings, targeted killings, and ambushes, many of which involved civilian casualties. The insurgents, emboldened by their success in mobilizing local support and gaining international attention, maintained their campaign of violence. Meanwhile, the Thai government, under increasing pressure from both domestic and international sources, struggled to find a solution that would restore peace and stability to the region. The conflict in southern Thailand remains unresolved to this day, and the events of May 2004 stand as a grim reminder of the complexities and challenges of managing insurgencies rooted in historical and political grievances. The lessons learned from this period, particularly the need for a comprehensive and inclusive approach to peace building, continue to inform discussions on how to address the deep divisions within Thai society and bring an end to the violence in the South. The events of May 2004 in southern Thailand were just the beginning of a prolonged period of unrest that would continue to plague the region for years to come. The Thai government's response to the insurgency remained focused on military solutions, yet it became increasingly clear that this approach was insufficient to address the deep-rooted issues that fueled the violence. The insurgency was not merely a series of isolated acts of terrorism. It was a manifestation of long-standing grievances within the Muslim-majority southern provinces. One of the most significant challenges faced by the Thai government in its efforts to quell the insurgency was the complex relationship between the local Muslim population and the state. For decades, the government had struggled to integrate the southern provinces into the broader Thai state framework. The region's distinct cultural and religious identity, along with its historical ties to Malaysia, made it difficult for the government to maintain control. As a result, the local population often felt marginalized and disconnected from the central government, leading to widespread resentment and, in many cases, support for the insurgents' cause. The insurgents capitalized on these feelings of alienation, framing their struggle as one of resistance against an oppressive state that had long ignored the needs of the southern provinces. They sought to create a separatist movement that would establish an independent or autonomous region for the Muslim Malays of southern Thailand. The insurgent groups, including the Barisan Revolusi Nasional, BRN, employed a variety of tactics to achieve this goal, including bombings, assassinations, and ambushes. Their methods, while effective in causing disruption, also led to significant loss of life among both military personnel and civilians. As the violence escalated, the government continued to insist that military action was necessary to restore order. However, the heavy-handed tactics employed by the Thai military often alienated the very population they sought to protect. Reports of human rights abuses, including extrajudicial killings, arbitrary detentions, and torture, emerged from the conflict zone. These actions further fueled resentment against the government and pushed many members of the local Muslim community toward supporting the insurgents. It became evident that the conflict was not simply one of terrorism, but also one of political and cultural identity. In the face of growing international condemnation, the Thai government was forced to consider alternative approaches to the conflict. There were calls from human rights organizations, as well as from within Thailand itself, for a shift away from military solutions toward a more diplomatic approach. Many argued that a lasting resolution to the conflict would require not only the cessation of violence, but also the recognition of the political, economic, and cultural rights of the people in the southern provinces. One key issue that needed to be addressed was the historical neglect of the region. The southern provinces had long been underdeveloped compared to the rest of Thailand, with poor infrastructure, limited access to education and healthcare, and a lack of economic opportunities. Many people in the south felt that their region had been ignored by the central government in Bangkok, which had focused its resources on more prosperous areas. This sense of neglect, combined with the government's inability to address the region's distinct cultural and religious identity, created a fertile ground for insurgent movements to gain support. Another significant factor in the insurgency was the issue of religious identity. The majority of Thailand's population is Buddhist, while the southern provinces are predominantly Muslim. The government's attempts to impose a uniform national identity on a region with a different cultural and religious heritage exacerbated tensions. Many in the south felt that their Muslim identity was under threat from the state's policies, which were perceived as favoring Buddhism and ignoring the needs of the Muslim population. This sense of cultural and religious marginalization fueled the insurgents' narrative and played a crucial role in garnering local support for their cause. In response to these grievances, some members of the Thai government began to call for a shift in policy. They argued that a more inclusive approach, one that recognized the unique identity of the southern provinces, was necessary to resolve the conflict. This would involve greater political autonomy for the region, the recognition of Islam as a central aspect of local identity, and increased investment in the region's economic development. Furthermore, there was a growing recognition that the insurgency could not be defeated through military means alone, and that a lasting peace would require dialogue and reconciliation between the government and the insurgent groups. However, efforts at peace talks and negotiations proved difficult. The insurgents, fractured into various factions, had no clear leadership or unified agenda, making it difficult for the government to engage in meaningful dialogue. Some insurgent groups rejected any form of negotiation, while others were open to talks but insisted on the recognition of their demands for greater autonomy or independence. The Thai government, for its part, was reluctant to concede to such demands, fearing that any concessions would undermine its authority and lead to further fragmentation of the country. In the years following the violence of May 2004, the insurgency in southern Thailand continued to smolder. The attacks and violence ebbed and flowed, but the underlying issues remained unresolved. The government's attempts at peace and reconciliation were often undermined by continued military action and human rights violations. Meanwhile, the insurgents maintained their fight, drawing on local grievances and the promise of a better future for the Muslim Malay population. The situation in southern Thailand is still unresolved, with the conflict continuing to this day. The violence has claimed thousands of lives, and the region remains one of the most unstable in Thailand. The lessons learned from the events of 2004, particularly the importance of addressing the root causes of the conflict and the need for a more inclusive and diplomatic approach, remain relevant. The path to peace in southern Thailand is long and fraught with challenges, but it is clear that a lasting solution will require more than just military force. It will require a genuine commitment to reconciliation, dialogue, and the recognition of the unique cultural and political needs of the southern provinces. Story 7. In June 2004, a significant legal case in the United States, Blakely versus Washington, brought attention to an important issue regarding sentencing practices within the criminal justice system. The case involved Ralph Howard Blakely Jr., who had been convicted in Washington state for kidnapping and assaulting his former wife. Under Washington's sentencing guidelines, the standard sentence range for his offense was 49 to 53 months. However, during sentencing, the judge found that Blakely had acted with deliberate cruelty, a factor not determined by a jury. Based on this finding, the judge increased Blakely's sentence to 90 months. The central question in this case was whether Blakely's Sixth Amendment right to a jury trial had been violated. Specifically, the issue was whether it was constitutional for a judge to impose an enhanced sentence based on facts not determined by a jury. The Sixth Amendment guarantees a defendant the right to have any factual findings that could increase a sentence beyond the standard range to be made by a jury, not by a judge. In a 5-4 decision, the United States Supreme Court ruled in favor of Blakely, holding that the Sixth Amendment does indeed prohibit judges from increasing sentences based on facts not found by a jury or admitted by the defendant. Justice Antonin Scalia, writing for the majority, emphasized that the statutory maximum, for the purposes of the Sixth Amendment, is the maximum sentence that can be imposed based solely on the facts reflected in the jury verdict or the defendant's admission. Therefore, any fact that would result in a sentence exceeding this statutory maximum must be submitted to a jury and proven beyond a reasonable doubt. The ruling had a profound impact on sentencing practices across the country. It invalidated sentencing systems that allowed judges to enhance sentences based on facts that were not proven to a jury, even if those facts were presented in the form of evidence during the trial. As a result of this decision, both state and federal sentencing guidelines were subject to significant changes. The court's decision prompted lawmakers to reevaluate sentencing procedures, ensuring that any factor that could increase a defendant's sentence beyond the statutory maximum would have to be proven by a jury. This reinforced the constitutional right to a jury trial and sought to prevent judges from imposing sentences based on facts that had not been fully scrutinized in a fair trial process. The Blakely case marked a key moment in the legal system, as it stressed the importance of jury involvement in determining the facts that could lead to an enhanced sentence. It aimed to ensure fairness and transparency in sentencing, reaffirming that the criminal justice system must follow a process that allows for public scrutiny and the protections guaranteed by the Constitution. This decision was part of a broader shift toward a more jury-centered approach to criminal sentencing, as it placed more responsibility on juries to determine the facts that could lead to an increased punishment. In essence, Blakely v. Washington reinforced the principle that any fact that could increase a defendant's sentence beyond the prescribed statutory maximum must be proven to a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. This decision emphasized the right to a fair trial and highlighted the importance of jury deliberations in the criminal justice system. It also set the stage for future legal developments, as subsequent cases examined and expanded upon the court's reasoning, further shaping the way sentencing and trial procedures were conducted in the United States. Following the Blakely decision, the implications for the criminal justice system were profound, particularly in terms of how sentencing would be carried out moving forward. The court's ruling set off a chain reaction in both state and federal courts, as it challenged long-standing practices where judges had the authority to increase sentences based on facts that had not been proven to a jury. Prior to Blakely, many states had implemented sentencing guidelines that allowed judges to enhance sentences based on facts they themselves determined, rather than requiring these facts to be established by a jury. One immediate consequence of the Blakely decision was that it brought into question the constitutionality of sentencing procedures in many states, especially those that employed what was known as indeterminate sentencing or guidelines-based sentencing. In these systems, judges had the discretion to adjust the defendant's sentence based on various factors, such as the severity of the crime, the defendant's past criminal history, or other elements that were not necessarily tied to the jury's verdict. While these factors often were presented during trial, the jury did not formally deliberate on them. As a result, the Blakely ruling sparked intense debate among lawmakers, legal professionals, and the public. Many state legislatures rushed to amend their sentencing laws to comply with the court's decision. Some states adopted new sentencing structures that required any fact that could lead to a longer sentence to be presented to and decided by a jury, not just the judge. This shift required significant changes to existing legal frameworks and sentencing procedures, with some states opting to move toward a system in which mandatory minimum sentences were directly tied to the jury's findings rather than a judge's discretion. In the wake of the decision, courts and legal scholars began to reconsider how sentencing enhancement factors should be treated within the context of the criminal justice system. Previously, the judge's discretion in imposing sentences was seen as a tool for ensuring that the punishment fit the crime, taking into account both the offense and the defendant's background. However, Blakely fundamentally changed this approach, asserting that any punishment above the statutory maximum could only be imposed based on facts that a jury had explicitly found, thus reinforcing the right to a trial by jury as an essential safeguard against potential judicial overreach. In the short term, the decision left many prosecutors and judges grappling with how to proceed in the wake of the ruling. Some trials had already been held under the assumption that the judge could determine certain facts to enhance a sentence, but with Blakely now in play, it meant that those facts would need to be addressed in a new way. This often meant retrials or reevaluating sentencing in cases where defendants had already been convicted but were sentenced under guidelines that were now considered unconstitutional. The criminal justice system faced a challenge of both adapting to the new legal standard and ensuring that defendants' rights were not violated during the process. For some, Blakely marked a shift toward more transparent and democratic sentencing practices. The ruling aligned with the core principles of the Sixth Amendment, which guarantees a defendant the right to have all critical facts presented and decided by a jury of their peers. By requiring a jury to determine any fact that could lead to a sentence beyond the statutory maximum, the court reinforced the notion that sentencing should not be left to the sole discretion of a judge. This would also mean that defendants could not be sentenced based on factors that had not been fully litigated and tested before a jury, offering a layer of protection against the potential for abuse or biased decision-making by judges. However, not everyone saw the Blakely decision as a step forward. Critics of the ruling argued that it placed unnecessary burdens on the judicial system, particularly with regard to the efficiency of trials. They contended that by requiring juries to deliberate over sentencing factors, the process would become more complicated and drawn out, leading to longer trials and more opportunities for legal appeals. Furthermore, some prosecutors expressed concern that the ruling might make it harder to secure convictions in cases where certain sentencing enhancements, such as those for prior convictions or aggravating circumstances, had previously been handled by judges. In response to Blakely, there was a subsequent series of decisions that further clarified the court's stance on sentencing and its relationship to jury trials. One of the most notable follow-ups was the United States versus Booker decision in 2005, which extended the reasoning in Blakely to the federal sentencing guidelines. In Booker, the Supreme Court ruled that the federal sentencing guidelines, which previously allowed judges to enhance sentences based on facts not found by a jury, were unconstitutional to the extent that they violated the Sixth Amendment. The court's decision in Booker reinforced the idea that any fact that could lead to an enhanced sentence must be determined by a jury, not a judge. Despite the clarity provided by Blakely and subsequent cases, the path forward for sentencing reform remained complicated. While many legal experts welcomed the court's emphasis on the jury's role in determining sentencing factors, there were still concerns about how the justice system could balance the need for individualized sentencing with the protections guaranteed by the Sixth Amendment. The reform process was not without its challenges, as it required lawmakers to navigate the complexities of sentencing law, while also ensuring that justice was served in a fair and consistent manner. As the legal landscape evolved, it became increasingly apparent that the Blakely ruling had sparked a broader conversation about the fairness and transparency of sentencing in the United States. While the decision was seen as a victory for defendants' rights, it also highlighted the tension between judicial discretion and the constitutional right to a jury trial. The evolving dialogue around Blakely and its aftermath underscored the importance of ensuring that the criminal justice system functions in a way that is both just and equitable, providing defendants with a fair trial while also allowing for the imposition of appropriate punishment. As the implications of Blakely versus Washington continued to unfold, the criminal justice system faced a period of significant reflection and reform. Legal scholars, practitioners, and policymakers alike grappled with the broader questions raised by the decision. What does it mean for a criminal justice system to be fair? How can the constitutional right to a jury trial be balanced with the need for effective sentencing practices? The decisions following Blakely would shape the future of sentencing law for years to come, continuing to push the conversation about the intersection of individual rights and state power. One of the most profound aspects of the Blakely ruling was its emphasis on the jury's role not just in determining guilt, but in determining the severity of the punishment. Prior to the decision, many believed that sentencing, as long as it remained within the boundaries set by law, was a matter best left to judicial discretion. Judges, after all, were considered the legal experts, trained to understand the nuances of a case, including the aggravating and mitigating factors that could influence sentencing. The Blakely decision, however, shifted that thinking, framing the issue as one of fundamental rights. If a sentence could be increased, it must be based on facts that a jury has determined beyond a reasonable doubt. This change had wide-reaching consequences for both the structure and function of the criminal justice system. For one, it marked a turning point in how sentencing could be approached. Blakely placed a much greater emphasis on transparency, as the facts that could lead to a more severe sentence would need to be publicly deliberated upon by a jury. This was seen by some as a victory for fairness, ensuring that the power to impose harsh sentences did not rest solely in the hands of a judge, but rather with the people, the jury, who were supposed to represent the community's sense of justice. The ruling also sparked a shift in how courts viewed plea bargaining and negotiated settlements in criminal cases. In many instances, defendants might plead guilty to lesser charges or agree to sentencing enhancements as part of a plea deal. Under Blakely, this practice became more complicated. If a defendant admitted to certain facts that could lead to an enhanced sentence, those facts would need to be presented to a jury and proven beyond a reasonable doubt. This could complicate the plea bargaining process, as defendants might hesitate to admit to facts that could lead to a longer sentence unless they were sure those facts could be proven in front of a jury. For prosecutors, Blakely created a shift in strategy. Sentencing became an area of greater concern, with prosecutors needing to think more carefully about how to structure their cases. In light of Blakely, many prosecutors began to focus more heavily on presenting facts that could lead to enhanced sentences, understanding that these facts would now need to be subjected to the scrutiny of a jury. While some viewed this as a natural evolution of the legal system, reinforcing the principle that a defendant's sentence should be determined by a group of their peers, others worried that it might slow down the judicial process, increasing the burden on already overtaxed court systems. At the state level, lawmakers were faced with a difficult question. How could they adjust their sentencing laws to align with Blakely without losing the ability to maintain control over sentencing decisions? In some states, legislators took the approach of revising their sentencing guidelines to ensure that any fact used to increase a sentence would need to be established by a jury. These revisions often required a delicate balance, ensuring that sentencing remained a tool for achieving justice without infringing upon defendants' constitutional rights. As a result, the criminal justice system underwent significant reforms, aimed at providing greater clarity in sentencing practices and a more transparent process. As states and federal courts began implementing new systems in response to Blakely, the ruling also had a ripple effect on the broader debate about the fairness of the criminal justice system. Blakely prompted lawmakers and reformers to reconsider the entire approach to sentencing in the U.S. For example, the ruling led to the reevaluation of mandatory minimum sentences, laws that dictated specific prison terms for certain crimes. Critics of mandatory minimums had long argued that they removed discretion from judges and led to disproportionately harsh sentences, particularly for nonviolent offenders. In light of Blakely, there was increased momentum for reforming or eliminating such mandatory minimums, as they often conflicted with the idea that sentencing should be based on facts proven to a jury. The Blakely decision also played a significant role in shaping future Supreme Court cases. In 2005, just a year after the ruling, the court issued its decision in United States v. Booker, which applied the reasoning in Blakely to the federal sentencing guidelines. In Booker, the court ruled that the federal guidelines, which allowed judges to enhance sentences based on facts not proven to a jury, were unconstitutional. This decision reaffirmed the principle that the right to a trial by jury extended beyond the determination of guilt, covering all elements of a defendant's punishment. The Booker decision not only reinforced the Blakely ruling, but also signaled a shift in how the criminal justice system viewed sentencing. However, while the Blakely and Booker decisions were seen by many as victories for defendants' rights, they also revealed deep divisions about the role of sentencing in achieving justice. The question of how much discretion judges should have in imposing sentences remained a point of contention. Proponents of judicial discretion argued that judges were best positioned to understand the complexities of individual cases and determine sentences that were appropriate to the specific circumstances. They cautioned that removing too much discretion could lead to overly rigid sentencing schemes that might not be capable of addressing the nuances of each case. Despite these concerns, the broader impact of Blakely was undeniable. The decision marked a significant shift in how the criminal justice system approached sentencing, emphasizing the need for greater fairness, transparency, and adherence to constitutional rights. It prompted a wave of reform, reshaping the way sentences were determined and ensuring that defendants' rights to a fair trial and protection from excessive punishment remained at the forefront of legal proceedings. The Blakely case, while initially met with resistance and uncertainty, became a cornerstone of sentencing reform, pushing the criminal justice system toward a more just and balanced future. Story 8. In 2004, one of the most notorious criminal cases in Australia involved the disappearance of an 18-year-old woman named Joanne Ratcliffe and her 11-year-old cousin, Kirst Gordon. The case became a significant part of Australian criminal history due to its disturbing nature and the long-lasting impact it had on the public. Joanne and Kirst vanished from the Adelaide Oval, a popular sporting venue in South Australia, during an Australian rules football match on August 25, 1973. They had been attending the match with their families, and while walking back to their seats, they mysteriously disappeared without a trace. At the time, their disappearance shocked the nation, as it was the kind of case that seemed to defy logic. The two girls were not seen leaving the grounds, and there were no witnesses who could account for what had happened. Despite extensive searches and investigations, no concrete evidence was found that could explain their disappearance. The case became an obsession for many, with the families of the two girls never giving up hope that they would one day be found. For years, theories and rumors swirled around the circumstances of their vanishing, but the case remained unsolved, leaving the families in a constant state of anguish. In 2004, after decades of investigation, a breakthrough came when new evidence was uncovered that would eventually lead to the identification of the perpetrators. The case had remained one of Australia's most haunting mysteries, but it would be in 2004 that the authorities began to piece together the events leading to the girl's disappearance. Detective Superintendent Des Bray, a veteran investigator, had been working on the case for several years and had a breakthrough in a key area. It was discovered that the man at the center of the investigation, who had been suspected for years, had been involved in another case of abduction, this time a more recent one. This suspect, a man named Derek Percy, had been convicted of the abduction and murder of a young child in the 1960s. He had been linked to a series of unsolved disappearances, and investigators believed that his involvement in the Ratcliffe and Gordon case was possible. Percy had been in the vicinity of the Adelaide Oval during the time of the girl's disappearance, and he had a history of committing crimes against young children. However, despite his past convictions and his known presence at the scene, there was no direct evidence linking him to the crime. The case became complicated as police began to examine Percy's history of violent behavior, including his association with other crimes involving children. His involvement in the 1960s case of the abduction and murder of a 12-year-old girl, which he had never been convicted of, raised alarm bells for investigators. Percy had served a sentence for his crime, but he had never shown any remorse for his actions. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered that Percy had been in contact with known associates who had a history of criminal activity. Many of these associates were believed to be involved in the disappearance of the girls, but there was no solid evidence to support these claims. The breakthrough came when police discovered a key piece of forensic evidence that linked Percy to the abduction of Joanne Ratcliffe and Kirst Gordon. The discovery of hair fibers at the crime scene was pivotal in the case, as it was determined that these fibers were consistent with Percy's DNA. This provided the crucial piece of evidence that led investigators to believe that Percy was, in fact, responsible for the disappearance of the two girls. Although he denied any involvement in the crime, the forensic evidence was enough to build a case against him. However, despite this, the authorities faced significant challenges in bringing him to justice due to the length of time that had passed since the crime. The case also highlighted the difficulties in dealing with long unsolved criminal cases. Many of the witnesses who had been present at the Adelaide Oval on the day of the disappearance had long since moved away, and their memories of the events had faded. Additionally, much of the evidence that could have been used to build a case was either lost or degraded over time. This left the investigators with the difficult task of piecing together a complex and often conflicting puzzle with limited resources. In the end, the case did not have a simple resolution. Despite the forensic evidence and the strong circumstantial case against Derek Percy, the police faced challenges in securing a conviction. The passage of time had made it difficult to gather additional evidence, and many of the key witnesses were no longer available. Percy, who had been serving a sentence for his other crimes, continued to deny any involvement in the disappearance of the two girls. The case, however, remained a haunting reminder of the vulnerability of young people and the long-lasting effects that unsolved crimes can have on families and communities. Despite the lack of closure, the efforts of investigators and the ongoing search for justice continued to keep the memory of Joanne and Kirst alive in the public consciousness. The case also brought to light the emotional toll that unsolved crimes can take on the families involved. For the Ratcliffe and Gordon families, the years of uncertainty were unbearable. The hope that their loved ones might one day be found was a constant presence in their lives, but as the years passed, the reality of the situation became increasingly difficult to face. Despite the evidence that pointed to Percy's involvement, the families struggled to find closure, as the legal system could not provide the answers they so desperately sought. For them, the disappearance of Joanne and Kirst was a tragedy that would never be forgotten, no matter how much time passed. In the years that followed, the case continued to resonate in Australia. It remained one of the most high-profile unsolved cases in the country, and the disappearance of Joanne Ratcliffe and Kirst Gordon was a story that was shared in newspapers, on television, and in public discourse. The case was often cited as a reminder of the importance of vigilance and the need for continued efforts to solve cold cases. It was a tragic reminder that even in a society that strives for justice, some stories remain incomplete, and some families must live with the unanswered questions that haunt them for a lifetime. The year 2004 marked a turning point in the investigation, but it also underscored the limitations of the criminal justice system in cases that span decades. While the discovery of forensic evidence was a crucial moment, the reality was that for the families of Joanne and Kirst, no amount of evidence could bring them the peace and closure they had longed for. In many ways, the case of the missing girls continues to serve as a symbol of both the persistence of hope and the painful reality of unresolved grief. In the years following the disappearance of Joanne Ratcliffe and Kirst Gordon, the investigation into their case continued in fits and starts, with authorities repeatedly revisiting old leads and re-examining pieces of evidence that had been overlooked or dismissed. It was only after the major breakthrough in 2004, when new forensic evidence linked Derek Percy to the crime, that the case regained momentum. The piece of evidence that was found, hair fibers recovered from the scene of the girls' abduction, was a breakthrough that seemed to offer the clarity that had long been absent. While the hair fibers were crucial in pointing investigators toward Percy, they were by no means a smoking gun. The evidence, though compelling, still left significant gaps. There was still no direct witness testimony that definitively linked Percy to the disappearance of the two girls. Furthermore, the years that had passed since the incident meant that much of the physical evidence at the scene had deteriorated. As time wore on, it became more and more difficult to gather the kind of airtight evidence needed for a conviction. In light of this challenge, investigators turned to the criminal history of Derek Percy, hoping that his past would shed light on his role in the 1973 case. Percy, a convicted murderer and suspected serial killer, had a long history of violent behavior. In 1969, he had been convicted of the abduction and murder of a young girl named Michelle Manning. That case had already cast a dark shadow over Percy's reputation, and he had been serving a prison sentence for that crime when new attention was brought to his potential involvement in the case of Ratcliffe and Gordon. Investigators found a disturbing pattern in Percy's history. He had a penchant for abducting young girls and keeping them for prolonged periods before disposing of them. There were similarities between his known crimes and the details of the Ratcliffe and Gordon case, which only increased the suspicion surrounding him. But despite the mounting evidence suggesting Percy's involvement, authorities faced the challenge of obtaining a conviction after so many years had passed. In Australia, as in many other countries, the passage of time can work against prosecutors in such cold cases, particularly when crucial witnesses are no longer available and physical evidence has been compromised. While Derek Percy remained the key suspect in the disappearance of Joanne and Kirst, the police faced an uphill battle in preparing a case that could hold up in court. In the absence of solid, direct evidence, they focused on building a circumstantial case, relying heavily on the hair fibers and the testimony of witnesses who had seen Percy in the vicinity of the Adelaide Oval on the day the girls disappeared. But even this was not enough to secure a conviction. Percy consistently denied any involvement in the case, and without conclusive evidence, the legal system struggled to bring him to justice. Despite these challenges, the families of Joanne and Kirst never gave up hope. The years of searching, the false leads, the frustration, it all took its toll on them. For decades, they lived with the nagging thought that their loved ones were out there somewhere, lost to the world. As time passed, the possibility of their survival became increasingly remote. But the hope that one day someone would be held accountable for their abduction kept them fighting for answers. For the Ratcliffe and Gordon families, the case became more than just about the search for justice. It was about keeping the memory of their loved ones alive. They spoke at public events, raised awareness of the case, and made efforts to keep the story in the public eye. Even when it seemed as though the investigation had stalled, the families continued to push for progress. Their persistence paid off when, in 2004, new evidence once again brought attention to the case. The emotional toll was immense, as every step forward in the investigation seemed to come with a reminder of how long they had been waiting for answers. At the same time, the case highlighted the flaws in the criminal justice system, especially in how cold cases are handled. While the advancements in forensic technology had made it possible to uncover new evidence in this case, it also underscored the need for reform in how such cases are prioritized. Many people believed that if the investigation had been pursued more aggressively from the start, there might have been a better chance of solving the case earlier. The emotional impact on the families of missing persons was immense, and the Australian public began to question why it took so long for the case to be properly revisited. The media played a key role in keeping the case alive over the years. Stories of the missing girls continued to appear in the news, fueling public interest and drawing attention to the ongoing efforts of the authorities. But it wasn't just the media coverage that kept the case in the public consciousness. It was the families, who refused to let their loved ones be forgotten, who kept the story alive. For the Ratcliffe and Gordon families, the effort to get answers was deeply personal, and their advocacy for justice resonated with the public, urging them to stay engaged in the search for the truth. The introduction of new forensic techniques in the early 2000s, such as DNA testing and more sophisticated methods of analyzing hair and fibers, proved invaluable in the case. The hair fibers that were discovered in 2004 provided a potential link to Percy, but they also raised questions about the reliability of the forensic techniques that were available at the time of the original investigation. As the case progressed, there was a growing realization that while modern technology could provide new insights, the evidence that could have secured a conviction decades earlier was often unavailable or inadmissible. Forensic investigators took great care to examine the case from every angle, combing through old files and re-interviewing witnesses who may have had information they didn't previously share. However, the passage of time meant that the clarity of many recollections was clouded. Many of the people who had been at the Adelaide Oval during the 1973 football match had moved on with their lives, and their memories of that fateful day had begun to fade. With each new piece of evidence uncovered, the investigation seemed to spiral deeper into complexity. Yet, despite all the challenges, the story of Joanne and Kirst was far from over. Their families, despite the overwhelming odds, never stopped searching for the truth, no matter how long it took. The impact of their loss continued to reverberate, and as the years passed, the hope that the case would one day be solved remained a driving force in their lives. The case of the missing girls from the Adelaide Oval, marked by the mystery of their abduction and the search for justice, remains an integral part of Australia's criminal history. Though it took decades for the investigation to gain traction, it was the tenacity of the families and the unrelenting efforts of investigators that kept the case alive. The determination to find the truth, even when all seemed lost, left an indelible mark on the community, a reminder of both the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring quest for justice. Despite all the evidence and attention surrounding Derek Percy, the case remained fraught with complications. Percy had always maintained his innocence in the disappearance of Joanne Ratcliffe and Kirst Gordon, and in the years since the case had resurfaced in 2004, he had become an even more elusive figure. The physical evidence that had been uncovered, the hair fibers, remained important, but as time went on, it became clear that these alone could not conclusively prove his involvement. There was still a gap in the chain of evidence that left doubts hanging in the air. In addition to the technical challenges of prosecuting a case with so little new direct evidence, there was a deeper problem that loomed over the investigation. The public's fascination with the case, which had only grown in the decades following the disappearance, had become part of its own complexity. Media reports, documentaries, and ongoing investigations brought with them a new level of scrutiny, but they also placed enormous pressure on the authorities to find answers. This was compounded by the public's emotional investment in the case. The public, too, had followed the case from the time of the girl's disappearance, and the fact that it remained unsolved had left many feeling unsettled. As investigators continued to scrutinize Percy's past and his connections to other unsolved disappearances, they discovered more unsettling details. Percy had been in the vicinity of several other unsolved cases in which young children had disappeared under similar circumstances, and his reputation as a suspected serial offender only added to the weight of the case. He had spent years in prison after being convicted of Michelle Manning's murder, but his potential involvement in the disappearance of Joanne and Kirst added a new layer of suspicion. This only intensified the pressure on law enforcement to pursue a resolution, to uncover the truth, and to seek justice for the families involved. However, with each new piece of evidence that was uncovered, the limitations of the criminal justice system became more apparent. The years of delay meant that witnesses who had once been crucial to the investigation were now difficult to reach, and many were unable to recall the specific details that might have helped secure a conviction. Memories had faded, and some key individuals had passed away. The lack of direct testimony made it harder to build a solid case. Even with modern forensic techniques at their disposal, investigators faced the heartbreaking truth that many of the most critical pieces of evidence had been lost to time. As the case continued to unfold in the years after the breakthrough in 2004, there was no shortage of people demanding justice for Joanne and Kirst. The case was frequently discussed in the media, often highlighted as one of Australia's most haunting unsolved mysteries. Each new revelation about Derek Percy's possible role in the crime sparked debates in the press. For the families of the two girls, this was both a source of hope and pain. While the renewed attention gave them a sense that the case was not being forgotten, the constant reminders of their loss were also a source of profound anguish. The public sympathy for the families grew, but as time wore on, there was a growing sense that the case would never have the neat resolution that people longed for. The truth of what happened to Joanne and Kirst remained just out of reach. The questions that haunted the investigation, the why and the how, remained unanswered. Despite this, the work of the investigators continued. Detective Superintendent Des Bray, who had been at the forefront of the investigation, refused to give up. He had seen too many cases like this one, where pieces of the puzzle were scattered, and justice seemed to be slipping further and further away. But he also knew that it was his job to keep fighting, to continue searching for any remaining clue that might bring closure to the case. But the case of Joanne and Kirst was not just about finding the truth. It was about the larger questions that haunted Australian society at the time. It raised critical issues about the vulnerability of children and the lengths to which society must go to protect them. It highlighted the flaws in the criminal justice system and the challenges faced by investigators when dealing with cold cases. It exposed how time could distort memories and complicate investigations, and how evidence could be lost or damaged as the years passed. While the breakthrough in 2004 had reignited hope, it also brought with it a new set of difficulties. Prosecuting a case that spanned so many years and was based on such circumstantial evidence was not easy. The legal system was ill-equipped to handle cases that were as old as this one, and this posed a significant barrier to achieving a conviction. Even as Percy's involvement seemed likely, the lack of conclusive, direct evidence meant that the case remained in limbo. The families of Joanne and Kirst, after all these years of waiting, had mixed emotions. They had lived through decades of uncertainty and grief, and now, with the renewed investigation, they found themselves caught between hope and despair. They wanted justice, but they also wanted closure. More than anything, they wanted to know what had happened to their loved ones and why. At the same time, the case had become a symbol of the power of perseverance. The fact that it was still being investigated, that new evidence had been uncovered, and that the families had never given up on seeking justice. These were all powerful reminders of the strength of the human spirit. The story of Joanne Ratcliffe and Kirst Gordon was no longer just a case. It was the story of the resilience of those who refused to let their loved ones be forgotten. While the case remains unresolved, the search for answers continued. It became clear that, in many ways, the mystery surrounding Joanne and Kirst would never be fully solved. The passage of time had made it almost impossible to find a clear resolution, and the families continued to live with the uncertainty of not knowing what had happened to their daughters. Still, the case remained a pivotal moment in Australian criminal history, and it demonstrated the complexities of solving a case after decades of searching. Even as the years passed and the chances of ever finding the full truth diminished, the case of Joanne Ratcliffe and Kirst Gordon remained a poignant reminder of the profound impact of unresolved disappearances. It served as a testament to the enduring desire for justice, no matter how long the wait might be. For the families, their pain had not subsided with time. Instead, it had been compounded by the unrelenting quest for answers, and it would continue to echo through generations to come. Story 9. In the year 2004, a criminal case in Australia captured public attention not for the brutality of the crime, but for the shocking nature of the perpetrator's actions. The case was that of the so-called Vandemonian fire, a devastating act of arson that took place in the heart of Melbourne's industrial district. The event, though seemingly an isolated incident, became an emblematic example of the kind of systemic failures that can allow a criminal to operate undetected for years. The fire itself left behind more than just smoldering ruins. It sparked a wave of fear and speculation about what might have been lurking beneath the surface of Melbourne's tight-knit communities. The fire occurred in the early hours of April 18, 2004, at a factory owned by a company called Vandemonian Industries. Located in a small industrial area on the outskirts of the city, the factory produced and stored a variety of materials, from industrial chemicals to manufacturing equipment. The fire quickly spread throughout the building, consuming everything in its path. By the time firefighters arrived, the factory was fully engulfed in flames, and it took them hours to bring the fire under control. The scale of the blaze and the speed with which it spread left investigators baffled, and there was immediate concern about the possibility of foul play. As the investigation began, it quickly became apparent that the fire had been deliberately set. Investigators discovered traces of accelerants at the scene, which pointed to arson. What began as a routine fire investigation soon turned into a complex case that involved an intense search for a suspect who, as it turned out, had been living in plain sight for years. The arson itself, though shocking, was only the tip of the iceberg in a story that would unravel deeper layers of deception, betrayal, and neglect. The first breakthrough in the case came when a security camera, hidden in the alley behind the factory, revealed a figure walking into the premises in the middle of the night. The footage was grainy, but it showed a man carrying what appeared to be a petrol container. With this new information, investigators began to comb through their list of suspects, hoping that someone would stand out. At first, the police had no leads, no obvious suspects. The owner of Vandemonian Industries, William McCabe, was a prominent businessman in the community, and his factory had a reputation for reliability and safety. It seemed unthinkable that anyone from within the company would want to destroy it, especially since McCabe had no known enemies. The factory's employees were equally perplexed, many of them expressing shock and disbelief that one of their own could be involved in something so heinous. As the investigation continued, it became clear that the fire had been set by someone with a deep knowledge of the factory's layout and operations. Whoever had done this knew exactly where to go to cause maximum damage, and it wasn't just a random act of vandalism. The precision and timing of the fire suggested that the person responsible had a personal motive, though no one could figure out what that might be. Days passed, and the investigation seemed to stall. The authorities had a suspect in mind, but lacked the evidence to make an arrest. It wasn't until they learned more about the relationships between McCabe and his employees that they began to piece together the story of who might have been behind the fire. One employee, a man by the name of Simon Harding, stood out. Harding had worked for Vandemonian Industries for several years, but in recent months, there had been whispers of trouble within the factory. Harding was an eccentric man, quiet and withdrawn, but he had begun to act strangely in the days leading up to the fire. Colleagues reported that he had become increasingly agitated, often talking about how the company was going under, and that the future looked bleak for the workers. There were also reports of him frequently arguing with McCabe about wages and working conditions. Some of the workers even claimed that Harding had been talking about taking drastic action to make his point clear, though no one had taken him seriously at the time. When investigators looked into Harding's personal life, they discovered that his financial situation was dire. He had accumulated substantial debt, which he had hidden from his family and friends. His relationship with his wife had become strained, and he was on the brink of losing his home. His behavior had become more erratic in recent weeks, and it was soon revealed that Harding had been under enormous personal stress. It appeared that he had reached a breaking point, and the fire at the Vandemonian factory was his desperate, misguided attempt to get attention. The investigators had their suspect. Simon Harding's motive was starting to make sense. It was clear that he had harbored a deep resentment toward his employer and was seeking revenge for perceived wrongs. But it wasn't until they began to investigate his actions leading up to the fire that they uncovered a chilling truth. Harding had not just been angry with McCabe and the company. He had planned the fire meticulously. It wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment act of violence. It had been carefully orchestrated. Harding had researched how to set fires using accelerants, and he had studied the factory's layout to ensure that the blaze would be as destructive as possible. His plan had been to send a message, though he didn't seem to realize the extent of the damage his actions would cause. What made the case even more disturbing was the discovery that Harding had gone to great lengths to cover his tracks. He had gone so far as to disable the factory's security cameras and alter the system's settings so that the footage would be unusable. However, the hidden camera that had caught him on tape was a lucky break for investigators, and it ultimately helped them piece together the timeline of events. Harding's attempts to cover his tracks had failed, and after being questioned by authorities, he eventually admitted to setting the fire. The investigation into Simon Harding's actions revealed just how deeply troubled he had become. His motives were rooted in a mixture of financial desperation, anger, and feelings of betrayal. The fire, he claimed, was not meant to kill anyone. It was simply intended to damage the company enough to get his point across. But Harding had grossly underestimated the danger of his actions. The fire had caused extensive damage to the factory and surrounding areas, and there was a real risk of it spreading to nearby buildings, which could have resulted in a much larger disaster. Harding's trial was a media spectacle, as the public struggled to comprehend the reasoning behind his extreme actions. His defense lawyers argued that he was suffering from severe stress and mental illness, but the prosecution maintained that his deliberate planning and actions showed a level of malice that could not be excused. In the end, Harding was convicted of arson, and he was sentenced to a lengthy prison term. His case remained a stark reminder of how unresolved personal issues and a sense of injustice could sometimes lead to catastrophic consequences. As Simon Harding's trial unfolded, the courtroom was filled with a mix of emotions from both the prosecution and the defense, with the former pushing for the maximum sentence, and the latter attempting to mitigate Harding's actions by attributing them to his personal struggles. The fact that Harding's fire had not claimed any lives seemed to add a layer of complexity to the case. While there was no doubt that the destruction was catastrophic, the absence of fatalities meant that the court's handling of the case would be influenced by various factors, including his intent, state of mind, and level of planning involved. The defense team argued that Simon Harding had been in the midst of a mental breakdown, pushed to the edge by mounting financial and emotional pressures. They painted a picture of a man who had been battling personal demons for months, and that the fire was a desperate cry for help rather than a calculated act of malicious destruction. Harding, they claimed, had been overwhelmed by his debts, his troubled marriage, and his dissatisfaction with his job, all of which had left him feeling powerless and desperate. The defense also suggested that he had experienced a breakdown in his perception of reality, which led him to believe that burning the factory down would somehow solve his problems. They highlighted Harding's erratic behavior in the weeks leading up to the fire. He had withdrawn from social activities, stopped speaking to colleagues, and had become visibly agitated at work. His performance had plummeted, and some of his coworkers recalled seeing him stare off into the distance with a blank expression, seemingly disconnected from the world around him. The defense emphasized that these signs of distress were indicative of a mental collapse, and therefore, Harding should not be viewed as a typical criminal. Instead, he was a man who had lost control of his emotions and judgment. The prosecution, however, countered these claims with evidence that suggested the fire had been anything but spontaneous. They brought attention to the meticulous planning that had gone into the arson. Security footage and testimony from the factory's workers painted a picture of Harding as someone who had been calculating in his actions. He had taken steps to disable the factory's security system, ensuring that the fire would go undetected for as long as possible. Furthermore, the accelerant he used to fuel the blaze was not something a person suffering from a mental breakdown would normally have access to. The prosecution argued that Harding had, in fact, been planning the fire for weeks, methodically preparing to execute his scheme without any regard for the safety of the people around him. One of the most chilling aspects of the case was the revelation that Harding had not only planned the fire in isolation, but had made steps to ensure that it would cause significant damage to the factory and its operations. He knew exactly where to pour the accelerant and where to set the fire to maximize destruction. The prosecution pointed out that, despite Harding's personal troubles, his actions were deliberate and that he had carefully chosen the time and place of the fire. The fact that he had not warned anyone or attempted to put out the flames before leaving suggested a lack of empathy and an indifference to the potential consequences. As the trial progressed, the families of the factory workers and local residents began to come forward with their own stories of how the fire had affected their lives. For some, it was a story of loss. Families had been living in fear, uncertain of whether they would receive a call with the news that their loved ones had been trapped inside the burning building. Others spoke of how their lives had been turned upside down by the fire, which had disrupted their sense of security in the community. The local business owners who had been nearby the factory also expressed concern about the long-term impact of the fire on the economy of the area. Several businesses were forced to shut down temporarily due to smoke damage, and the community's sense of trust had been shaken. The entire area had been enveloped in fear, not knowing if something like this could happen again. The emotional testimonies of these individuals painted a picture of the deep scars left by the fire. While no one had been physically harmed, the psychological toll it had taken on the community was immense. Local leaders and activists voiced their concerns that the case was more than just about the fire itself. It was a symbol of how seemingly ordinary people, driven to extremes by personal crises, could turn their desperation into destructive actions that rippled through entire communities. As the defense tried to salvage Harding's case, arguing that he should be given a chance for rehabilitation, the prosecution remained resolute in their stance that the severity of the crime warranted a strong sentence. They pointed out that Simon Harding had committed an act of calculated violence, even if no one had died. His complete disregard for the safety of the workers, the families, and the community at large was inexcusable. The prosecution emphasized that people like Harding, who deliberately set fires with the intent to cause destruction, could not simply be treated as victims of personal circumstances. They had to be held accountable for their actions. When the verdict was finally delivered, the courtroom fell silent. Harding was convicted of arson, and the judge sentenced him to 12 years in prison. The sentence was a reminder that while the law had its nuances, there were still boundaries that could not be crossed. In Harding's case, the overwhelming evidence of his planning and the devastating impact of his actions far outweighed the personal struggles he had been facing. For the judge, it was clear that Harding had gone beyond what could be considered a mere emotional outburst or breakdown. His actions had been premeditated, and he had caused significant harm to the community. Simon Harding's sentence was a sobering conclusion to the case. As he was led away in handcuffs, the impact of his actions rippled through the families affected by the fire, the community at large, and even the legal system itself. The case became a point of reflection for many who had followed it closely. It raised important questions about the fine line between personal distress and criminal behavior, and how individuals who feel trapped by their circumstances can sometimes lash out in destructive ways. Harding's case would remain a haunting reminder that while we may never fully understand what drives a person to such extremes, the consequences of their actions can be far-reaching and irreversible. In the aftermath of the case, the community began the long process of healing. The factory was eventually rebuilt, but the memories of that fateful night would linger. As for Simon Harding, his future was uncertain. He would spend the next decade in prison, his life forever marked by the terrible mistake he had made. But for the people who had been affected by the Vandemonian fire, the scars would never fully heal. They would carry the weight of that night with them, always wondering if there was anything that could have been done to prevent the tragedy from unfolding in the first place. Simon Harding's conviction and the resulting sentence seemed to bring closure to the case, but the reverberations of the Vandemonian fire continued to affect not only those directly involved but the broader community. The investigation had unveiled just how deeply personal and rooted in mental strain the motives behind the fire were. As Harding was carted off to prison, his case was frequently discussed in the media, sparking debates about the intersection of mental health, crime, and responsibility. While Harding's defense had attempted to portray him as a victim of his own circumstances, citing his financial struggles, deteriorating marriage, and mental distress, the prosecution had succeeded in painting him as a calculated individual who knew exactly what he was doing. This was not the impulsive act of a mentally unstable man. This was the work of someone who had taken careful steps to ensure maximum destruction. His knowledge of the factory layout, his deliberate planning, and his choice of accelerants all pointed to an individual who had made a conscious decision to harm his employer and the community, regardless of the personal turmoil he faced. In the months following the trial, the families of the workers and the local residents continued to deal with the aftermath of the fire. Some struggled to find closure. They were left to pick up the pieces of their lives, trying to reconcile the image they had of Harding with the reality of what he had done. Many of them had worked alongside him for years and had considered him a colleague, even a friend. His quiet demeanor and long-standing presence at the factory had made it difficult for anyone to imagine that he could harbor such resentment or anger. For the workers who had been in the factory that night, the psychological scars were not as easy to heal. Many spoke about the terrifying moments when the fire broke out, when they realized that something had gone terribly wrong and they needed to escape quickly. The factory had been a place of security, and the idea that one of their own could have been behind the destruction created an atmosphere of betrayal. Some of the workers sought counseling to cope with the trauma, but for others, the emotional toll lingered far beyond the fire. The incident had shattered their sense of safety and trust, leaving them unsure about the future of their livelihoods. The local community, too, was left grappling with the aftermath. In the wake of the fire, many businesses in the surrounding area suffered from a temporary shutdown, as the damage to the factory and the surrounding environment was extensive. The economic loss was significant, but the emotional fallout was even more profound. Neighbors expressed a deep sense of betrayal and fear, as they began to wonder if there were others like Harding, individuals living among them who might one day decide to act out in such destructive ways. People who had once felt safe in their quiet suburban streets now found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew about their community. For the authorities, Harding's case presented a challenge that many had not fully anticipated. The complexity of the situation highlighted the thin line between personal tragedy and criminal intent. It led to a wider conversation about how individuals in similar situations might be prevented from acting on their anger and desperation. Could there have been signs of Harding's intent before the fire? Could his escalating stress have been caught earlier? These questions, though difficult to answer, were discussed in greater detail in the media, with calls for greater mental health awareness and support for workers dealing with stress in the workplace. The fire itself was not just a local event. It had become a symbol of larger societal issues. People began to ask whether companies were doing enough to recognize the mental health needs of their employees, particularly those who had been working in high-stress environments or had been under financial pressure. Some experts argued that companies like Vandemonian Industries should have taken more steps to address worker well-being, pointing to Harding's deteriorating mental state as a warning sign. Others, however, argued that such concerns were not always easy to identify, especially when employees kept their struggles hidden from their employers. The media attention surrounding the case had its own effects on Harding. While he was incarcerated, his story became a point of reflection for many. Some saw him as a tragic figure, consumed by his own personal crises and unable to see the consequences of his actions. Others viewed him as a criminal who had carefully planned the destruction of the factory, fully aware of the potential damage he could cause. Harding's own perspective on the situation was murky. In interviews, he had expressed remorse, but his apologies seemed to fall short of the profound regret expected by the public. He had destroyed lives, not just with the fire, but with the breach of trust, the emotional turmoil, and the financial hardships it caused. During his time in prison, Harding continued to reflect on the events that led up to that fateful night. He had regular therapy sessions, which were part of his rehabilitation program, and it became clear that he was not just seeking forgiveness from others, but also from himself. His behavior and demeanor seemed to shift as he moved further away from the person he had been before the fire, but many who had followed the case remained unconvinced of his true transformation. The question remained, could a person like Harding ever truly be rehabilitated, or was his crime too great for any amount of reflection to restore what had been broken? As the years went by, the fire at Vandemonian Industries slowly faded from the headlines, but it remained a dark chapter in the lives of those affected. The factory was eventually rebuilt, and the area around it began to recover, but the emotional wounds left behind would take much longer to heal. Simon Harding's name continued to resurface from time to time, whenever people discussed the intersection of crime, mental health, and personal responsibility. The incident would go down as a cautionary tale for future generations, an example of how unchecked personal struggles, if left unaddressed, could lead to tragic outcomes for both the individual and the community. In the end, the story of the Vandemonian fire was not just one of criminality and punishment, but one of a fractured society, struggling to address the complex issues surrounding mental health, corporate responsibility, and personal accountability. It forced many to reconsider how we view those who commit crimes, not just as perpetrators, but as individuals with deeper stories, often hidden beneath layers of pain, pressure, and resentment. Harding's actions were reprehensible, but they were also a reflection of larger, unresolved issues that society had yet to fully confront. The fire he set would continue to burn in the memories of all those affected, a stark reminder of how far-reaching the consequences of one man's desperate act could be. Story 10. In 2004, Japan experienced a crime that shocked the nation and sent waves of disbelief through its communities. The case involved a series of brutal murders, orchestrated by a group that seemed to have carefully planned and executed their actions with chilling precision. The events, which would later become known as the Shibuya murders, unfolded in one of Tokyo's most vibrant districts, a place known for its bustling nightlife, fashion, and entertainment. But beneath the neon lights and the crowds, a dark plot was quietly taking shape, one that would soon disrupt the lives of many and stain the city with a tragic tale of betrayal, manipulation, and death. The Shibuya murders began on a warm spring evening in May 2004. A young woman, only 23 years old, was found brutally murdered in an upscale apartment near Shibuya Station. The victim, Yumi Nakamura, had been an aspiring model and actress, a woman whose life had been full of promise. Her body was discovered by her roommate, who had returned from a late-night shift at a nearby cafe. The scene was gruesome. Nakamura had been stabbed multiple times, her lifeless body left on the floor of her apartment, a pool of blood surrounding her. At first, the police were puzzled. There seemed to be no immediate motive. The apartment had not been ransacked, and there was no indication that anything of value had been stolen. The investigation began, but no solid leads were available. The police initially focused on Nakamura's personal life, interviewing her friends, family, and acquaintances to gather any potential clues. They soon learned that Nakamura had been involved in a romantic relationship with a man named Taro Takahashi, a 28-year-old who worked as a photographer in the entertainment industry. Takahashi, a man with a reputation for being charming yet temperamental, became one of the primary persons of interest in the case. Takahashi was known to have been possessive of Nakamura, and there had been rumors of tension between the two. Neighbors reported hearing loud arguments from the couple's apartment in the days leading up to the murder. Takahashi, however, denied any involvement in the crime. He claimed that he had been at a nightclub in Roppongi on the night of the murder, with several friends who could vouch for his whereabouts. The police, while skeptical of his alibi, found no concrete evidence that could directly link him to Nakamura's death. As they dug deeper into his background, they discovered a dark secret. Takahashi had been heavily in debt and had recently lost several lucrative contracts with modeling agencies. But there was no clear motive for murder, at least not one that could explain the brutality of the crime. The case grew cold as weeks passed, and the public's attention began to shift elsewhere. However, just 2 months later, another murder occurred, and it was eerily similar to Nakamura's. This time, the victim was a 29-year-old woman named Haruka Sato, a rising star in the fashion world. Sato's body was discovered in her own apartment in the Minato ward of Tokyo. She too had been stabbed multiple times, and once again nothing appeared to be stolen. As in Nakamura's case, the police found no immediate suspects or obvious motives. The pattern was undeniable. 2 women, both young and successful, both involved in the entertainment industry, both brutally murdered. The police could not ignore the growing connection between the deaths, and they began to question whether these killings were the work of the same individual or group. It was clear that the murders had not been random acts of violence. They were calculated, and the killer, or killers, had some kind of specific target in mind. As the investigation into Haruka Sato's murder progressed, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A former associate of Takahashi's, a man named Kenji Yamamoto, came forward with a chilling confession. Yamamoto revealed that Takahashi had confided in him just days before Nakamura's murder. According to Yamamoto, Takahashi had been struggling with his career, his personal relationships, and his mounting debts. He had become obsessed with the idea of making a name for himself, and he had begun to use his connections in the industry to manipulate young women into compromising positions. According to Yamamoto, Takahashi had once told him, "If I can't make it, then no one can." Yamamoto also claimed that Takahashi had become fixated on Sato and Nakamura, viewing them as rivals who were stealing the spotlight from him. He believed that if he could eliminate these women, he would be able to take their places in the entertainment industry. Yamamoto's information, though chilling, provided a potential motive for the murders. The police quickly moved to arrest Takahashi for questioning. When Takahashi was confronted with the new evidence, he initially denied any involvement in the murders. However, as the police pressed him, he finally broke down. In a moment of confession, Takahashi admitted to both killings. He described in detail how he had meticulously planned each murder, choosing the perfect moment to strike when his victims were alone and vulnerable. He confessed to luring them into false senses of security before brutally attacking them in their own homes. His motives, according to him, were driven by a mixture of jealousy, rage, and the belief that he was entitled to the success these women had achieved. He believed that by eliminating them, he could step into their roles in the industry. Takahashi's confession shocked not only the police, but also the entire nation. The idea that a man so seemingly charming and connected in the entertainment world could harbor such violent tendencies was difficult for many to comprehend. His actions, rooted in deep-seated envy and personal failures, shattered the illusion of the glamorous world he had once inhabited. The news of the murders and Takahashi's arrest spread rapidly through the media, and the public was left to grapple with the dark side of the entertainment industry. As the investigation deepened, more unsettling revelations about Takahashi's personal life began to emerge. It became clear that his outward persona, an aspiring photographer with connections to some of Japan's most prominent figures in fashion, was a facade, one that hid his true nature. Despite his professional success, Takahashi was struggling with his inner demons. His mental state had been deteriorating for years, and his inability to cope with his mounting failures became the fuel for his increasingly erratic behavior. The more the police learned about Takahashi's history, the more disturbing his actions seemed. Takahashi's career had once been full of promise. He had worked for well-known fashion magazines, and his photographs had appeared in numerous advertisements. However, as the years passed, his star began to fade. The industry that had once embraced him was no longer as receptive to his work. His photography began to be seen as outdated, and he found himself edged out by younger, more talented artists. The contracts he once had with modeling agencies dried up, and his debts began to pile up. The pressure to maintain an image of success, coupled with his increasing financial instability, created a perfect storm of stress and anger within him. But it was not just his professional life that was in turmoil. Takahashi's personal relationships had also deteriorated. His relationship with Yumi Nakamura, once a source of joy, had become fraught with tension. Nakamura, a beautiful and talented young woman, had ambitions of her own in the entertainment industry. She had grown tired of Takahashi's possessiveness and emotional volatility, and their relationship had become increasingly toxic. Her decision to distance herself from him had enraged him, further stoking his feelings of inadequacy and resentment. It was these personal frustrations that seemed to fuel Takahashi's descent into violence. His jealousy over the success of Nakamura and Sato, both women who had gained recognition in the very same world he had once been a part of, became a defining feature of his mindset. In his mind, they were not just rivals, they represented everything he had lost: youth, beauty, and the career he once thought he could control. To Takahashi, their success was a reminder of his failure. It became clear that his obsessive behavior went beyond mere envy. He felt a deep need to rid himself of these reminders, to destroy what he saw as obstacles to his own redemption. Takahashi's confessions painted a disturbing picture of premeditation. He described how he had meticulously planned both murders, selecting his victims not randomly, but based on their proximity to the industry he had once been a part of. He had followed both women for weeks, learning their routines and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. In the case of Yumi Nakamura, he had arranged to meet her under the guise of discussing a potential photography project. But when the two of them were alone in her apartment, his intentions took a darker turn. Takahashi spoke of the moments leading up to the murder as though they were detached from reality. He spoke of how he had waited for the right time, how he had carefully chosen the knife he would use, and how, when the attack came, it was swift and brutal. In his mind, it was not murder, it was an act of reclaiming control. Haruka Sato's murder followed a similar pattern. Takahashi had been aware of Sato's rising prominence in the fashion industry, and he saw her as a direct threat to his own standing. Despite his fading career, he believed that Sato represented the future he had lost, and he was determined to eliminate her as well. He had stalked her for days, watching her from a distance, learning her schedule. Once he had a sense of her routine, he moved in, luring her to her apartment under the pretense of a photography session. Once inside, he acted with cold precision, striking without hesitation. For Takahashi, the murders were not spontaneous bursts of rage, but rather calculated acts of control. The sense of power he felt as he took these women's lives was something he had never experienced before. It was a perverse sense of accomplishment, an attempt to reclaim what he felt had been unjustly taken from him. Takahashi's motives, though rooted in personal failure and emotional instability, were far more complex than mere jealousy. In his twisted mind, the murders were a means to restore the balance he had lost. He saw them as an act of purging, a way to cleanse himself of the feelings of inferiority that had festered for so long. As the police continued to unravel the details of Takahashi's actions, they also discovered the extent of his manipulation. Takahashi had carefully cultivated relationships with those around him, always presenting himself as a sympathetic figure. He had many acquaintances in the entertainment industry who trusted him, not realizing the depths of his obsession and resentment. He had always been able to charm those around him, using his connections and charisma to mask his insecurities and darker impulses. It was only when his true nature was revealed through his confession that the full scope of his manipulations became apparent. The police investigation also revealed a disturbing detail. Takahashi had not acted alone. While he had been the one to carry out the murders, it was discovered that he had received assistance from a group of individuals who shared his desire for revenge against those in the entertainment industry. These individuals, who had their own grievances and frustrations, had supported Takahashi in his efforts to carry out the murders. They helped him gather information on his victims, provided him with the tools he needed, and even helped him cover up evidence after the murders were committed. The group, which consisted of former associates and acquaintances of Takahashi, had been drawn into his web of lies and manipulation. They, too, believed that they were helping him achieve something worthwhile, when in reality, they were aiding in a series of heinous crimes. As the trial began, the public's reaction to Takahashi's actions was one of disbelief and horror. The fact that such a calculated and cold-blooded individual could have been hiding in plain sight for so long was something that left many shaken. The case sparked a wider conversation about the pressures of the entertainment industry, the fragility of mental health, and the dark side of ambition. Takahashi's story became a cautionary tale for many, a reminder that even those who seem to have it all can be hiding deep, destructive insecurities beneath the surface. As the court proceedings continued, the victims' families, friends, and colleagues struggled to come to terms with the loss of their loved ones and the profound impact of Takahashi's actions on their lives. The Shibuya murders would go down in history as one of the most shocking and tragic crimes in Japan's modern history, leaving a deep scar on the city of Tokyo and its vibrant entertainment world. As Takahashi's trial continued, his defense team attempted to portray him as a man who had been driven to madness by a combination of personal failure, financial ruin, and the pressures of the entertainment industry. They argued that he had been suffering from a mental breakdown during the murders, and that his actions were not entirely within his control. The defense even went so far as to claim that Takahashi's history of emotional instability and depression had clouded his judgment, pushing him to commit the heinous crimes. However, the prosecution was firm in its stance. They rejected the notion that Takahashi's mental state could serve as an excuse for such brutal murders. They pointed out that the murders were not the result of an impulsive outburst, but rather part of a deliberate, methodical plan. Takahashi had stalked both Yumi Nakamura and Haruka Sato for weeks, carefully studying their routines and waiting for the opportune moment to strike. He had used his knowledge of their lives to manipulate and deceive them, gaining access to their homes under false pretenses before carrying out his attacks. His confession was chilling in its detail, with Takahashi admitting that he had spent days thinking about how to eliminate his victims. This, the prosecution argued, was not the action of a man overcome by madness, but rather someone who had fully understood the consequences of his actions, yet chose to carry them out anyway. The courtroom was filled with tension as the trial unfolded, with the families of the victims, especially Nakamura and Sato, attending each day. Their grief was palpable as they listened to the gruesome details of the murders, the overwhelming sense of loss hanging heavy in the air. The victims' families spoke at length about the love, joy, and promise that both women had brought to their lives before they were stolen away so suddenly. It became clear that Yumi Nakamura and Haruka Sato were not just victims in a criminal case. They were daughters, sisters, and friends. Their deaths left a void in the hearts of those who had known and loved them. For the families, the courtroom became a place not just for legal proceedings, but for their chance to be heard. In tearful testimonies, Nakamura's mother spoke of her daughter's dreams, the future she had worked so hard to build. Nakamura had been on the verge of breaking into the film industry, having received several offers from major production companies. Her mother shared how proud she was of her daughter's determination to succeed, how much she had been looking forward to seeing her name in lights. It was a heartbreak that no parent should have to endure, losing a child in such a senseless and brutal way. Similarly, Sato's family spoke of their loss with quiet dignity. They described their daughter as a vibrant soul, a woman who had so much ahead of her. Haruka had been a rising star in the fashion world, and her future had seemed limitless. In one of the most poignant moments of the trial, Haruka's father, overcome with emotion, described the last time he had seen his daughter before her death. He recalled her excitement about an upcoming photo shoot, how she had shared her dreams of expanding her career and helping others. She was full of life, he said through his tears. She had so much to give. And now it's all gone. As the defense tried to argue that Takahashi's actions were the result of a mental illness, it was clear that his victims' families were unconvinced. They could not fathom how anyone, no matter how disturbed, could take the lives of two promising young women with such cold calculation. They demanded justice, not just for the victims, but for the countless others who had been affected by the tragedy. Takahashi's mental state was also scrutinized by experts. Psychiatric evaluations were presented in court, detailing his history of depression, anxiety, and obsessive tendencies. He had been prescribed medication in the past, but there was little evidence to suggest that he had been actively seeking treatment at the time of the murders. The defense tried to argue that Takahashi had been overwhelmed by his mental health issues, but the prosecution painted a different picture. One of a man who, despite his personal struggles, had been fully aware of his actions. As the trial reached its conclusion, the judge addressed the gravity of the situation. He acknowledged the complexity of the case, noting the tragic loss of life and the deep emotional scars left on the victims' families. He also highlighted the deep psychological torment that Takahashi had evidently suffered, but ultimately, he made it clear that the law must take precedence over any personal suffering. The crimes Takahashi had committed were unforgivable, and he would be held accountable for his actions. On the final day of the trial, Takahashi's fate was sealed. The jury deliberated for only a short period before returning with a verdict of guilty on both counts of murder. The courtroom was quiet as the judge delivered the sentence. Takahashi was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. His defense had hoped for a reduced sentence based on his mental state, but the severity of the crimes and the premeditated nature of his actions left little room for leniency. The verdict was met with a mixture of relief and sorrow. For the families of Nakamura and Sato, the conviction brought a small sense of closure, but it did little to ease the pain of their loss. The grief would linger long after the trial ended. As Takahashi was led away in handcuffs, he showed no emotion, his face cold and impassive. It was as though he had been detached from the world around him, completely indifferent to the lives he had destroyed. The Shibuya murders would go down in history as one of Japan's most disturbing and senseless crimes. The tragedy left a deep scar on the entertainment industry, which was forced to reckon with the darkness that could lurk behind the glamour and fame. The public was forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that even those who seemed to have it all could harbor deep, destructive emotions that, when left unchecked, could result in unfathomable violence. For the victims, their families, and the people of Japan, the case was a stark reminder of the fragile line between success and failure, and the devastating consequences of unchecked ambition. Story 11. In the summer of 2005, a disturbing and tragic case shocked the American public, one that would remain unresolved for years, casting a shadow over the small town of Shreveport, Louisiana. It all started on a hot July evening, when a 22-year-old woman named Jessica Owens went missing. She had been a quiet, reserved individual, working as a receptionist at a local law firm. Her disappearance seemed like just another unfortunate incident, yet the growing suspicion surrounding her case would soon tell a different story. Jessica was last seen leaving her workplace around 6 p.m., walking toward her car in the poorly lit parking lot. She had been talking to a friend on the phone when the line suddenly went dead. Her friend, a co-worker named Amanda, tried calling back several times, but there was no answer. Jessica had been known to drive home late, often working overtime, but that night, she never made it back to her apartment. Her phone was found later, abandoned in a nearby alley, its screen cracked as if it had been tossed or dropped hastily. The local police initially believed Jessica may have simply gotten lost or had an accident. Shreveport was a quiet town, and it was unusual for such a young woman to be caught up in anything sinister. Yet, as the days passed without a trace, the search grew more urgent. The investigation quickly turned into a manhunt. The town was no stranger to crime, but nothing like this had ever happened before. A sense of dread began to creep over the community. As authorities combed through the area, they stumbled upon surveillance footage from a nearby gas station. It showed a man, tall and unremarkable, approaching Jessica's car just moments after she had parked. The footage wasn't clear enough to identify him, but it raised questions. The man didn't seem to be in a rush, but his behavior was peculiar. He glanced around nervously, as if ensuring no one was watching. Within hours, the case had gone from a missing person to a possible abduction. A task force was quickly assembled to search for Jessica, and the local news began running stories every hour. The public was terrified. The thought of someone preying on innocent victims in broad daylight rattled everyone. The police had little to go on, but the footage of the strange man sparked a few leads. Several tips came in, including one from a local resident who believed the man might have been someone she had seen walking around the neighborhood for weeks. He appeared harmless, just another face in the crowd, but now the police had to reconsider everything. Days turned into weeks, and despite the media frenzy, there was still no sign of Jessica. The small town of Shreveport was on edge, with people locking their doors and whispering about the possibility of a serial abductor. Some wondered if this could be the work of a predator who had been watching for months, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The police, under increasing pressure, worked tirelessly but were haunted by one question. What had happened to Jessica Owens? The case took a sudden turn when a second woman, 25-year-old Melissa Carter, was reported missing just a few weeks later. She, too, had been last seen leaving her workplace in the early evening. But this time, her disappearance was even more chilling. Melissa's car was found parked in the same lot as Jessica's. It was as if history was repeating itself. Police now feared they were dealing with a serial abductor, someone who had been biding their time, selecting victims who seemed to blend into the background, people who would go unnoticed until it was too late. As the investigation deepened, detectives began to draw parallels between the two disappearances. Both women were young, working professionals with little to no known enemies. Neither had any history of conflict or dangerous relationships. It appeared, at least at first, that they were random victims, selected for no apparent reason. But then the breakthrough came. A new lead emerged when a witness came forward, a man who claimed to have seen a suspicious figure lurking near the parking lot the evening Jessica had vanished. The man was certain he had seen the same figure near the scene when Melissa disappeared weeks later. This man, who had been too afraid to come forward earlier, told detectives that he had seen a black van parked nearby on both occasions. The sighting seemed insignificant at the time, but now it felt like a crucial piece of the puzzle. Investigators quickly set out to find the van. They scoured the town, checking rental records and local businesses, hoping for a lead. It was a painstaking process, but eventually they tracked down the vehicle, a 1998 Ford Econoline van, through a series of witnesses who had seen it in the area. It was registered to a local man, a 48-year-old mechanic named Carl Peterson. Peterson was known around Shreveport as a quiet, unassuming man. He had no criminal record, no history of violence, and appeared to be a hard worker. But as the detectives dug deeper into his life, they uncovered unsettling details. Carl Peterson had lived alone for years in a modest house on the outskirts of town. Neighbors described him as eccentric, but harmless. However, they also mentioned that he had been acting strangely in recent months, paranoid, reclusive, and obsessed with cleaning his van, especially the interior. The more detectives learned about Peterson, the more questions began to arise. Why was he so obsessed with his van? What had he been doing around the time of the disappearances? As they sought a warrant to search his property, they had no idea that their investigation was about to take a darker turn. The tension in Shreveport reached a fever pitch as the search for Carl Peterson's van intensified. The local authorities, along with state investigators, moved quickly to secure a search warrant for Peterson's property. His house, tucked away in a quiet part of town, appeared unremarkable at first glance, just another small, aging residence on a tree-lined street. Yet, as the police descended on the area, it became clear that the situation was far more complicated than anyone could have anticipated. When they arrived at Peterson's home, the front door was locked, and no one answered their knocks. The neighbors watched nervously from their windows, some of them whispering to each other, speculating on what was going on. The police were careful not to alert Peterson, but they knew time was running out. With the warrant in hand, they forced their way into the house, and what they found inside shocked them to their core. Carl Peterson's home was sparse, almost clinical in its neatness. There was no sign of disorder, no evidence of a violent struggle, nothing to suggest that anything sinister had occurred there. However, as they began to search more thoroughly, they made a disturbing discovery in the basement, a collection of photographs. Hundreds of photos, some of them professionally taken, others more casual, but all focused on young women. Many of the women were unfamiliar, their faces hauntingly beautiful in their normalcy, their eyes vacant, as if they were captured in a moment of utter obliviousness. And as investigators flipped through the photos, they realized that some of them resembled Jessica Owens and Melissa Carter, women who had now been missing for weeks. But it wasn't just the photographs that caused unease. It was the carefully marked dates on the backs of each one. Peterson had documented their movements, where they had been, when they had passed by certain streets or entered specific stores. It became apparent that these women had been under his watch for much longer than anyone had known. He had been keeping track of their routines, learning their schedules, and biding his time. The photos were disturbing enough, but it was the realization that Peterson had been stalking his victims for months, perhaps even years, that made the case take on a new, far darker dimension. As the investigation deepened, the police found more evidence that suggested Peterson's involvement in the disappearances. They located a hidden room in the back of the basement, a room that was sealed off from the rest of the house. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the walls were lined with old newspapers, many of them yellowed with age. But in the center of the room was something far more chilling. A small desk, covered in maps and notes, with pins and strings crisscrossing across them, connecting various locations throughout Shreveport. The maps seemed to indicate places where Peterson had been, spots where he had likely observed his victims. Even more unsettling was the discovery of a large, locked chest in the corner of the room. When the police managed to open it, they found it filled with small personal items, belongings taken from the missing women. Pieces of jewelry, a wallet, a pair of earrings that once belonged to Melissa Carter, and a necklace that Jessica Owens had been wearing the last time anyone saw her. It was as if Peterson had been collecting trophies, keepsakes from the women he had watched, following their lives from the shadows until he had made his move. The more they uncovered, the more the patterns seemed to emerge. It was clear that Peterson had been stalking not just Jessica and Melissa, but possibly other women before them. But with no bodies, no definitive proof that he had harmed them, the police were left to wonder just how far his obsession had gone. They still had no idea whether Peterson had abducted the women, or if they were still alive somewhere. The possibilities were terrifying, each one darker than the last. With this new evidence in hand, the police arrested Carl Peterson on charges of kidnapping and unlawful detention. His arrest sent shockwaves through Shreveport, as residents began to question how someone so seemingly ordinary had hidden such dark secrets for so long. Peterson was calm during his arrest, almost eerily composed, as if he had been expecting this moment. He made no attempt to resist, no effort to flee or cover his tracks. His silence only fueled the growing suspicion that he knew far more than he was letting on. But despite their best efforts, Peterson remained tight-lipped, refusing to speak about the missing women. He was careful with his words, choosing to say nothing at all. His attorney maintained that he was innocent, that the evidence against him was circumstantial at best. But as the days wore on, the police began to piece together the full extent of Peterson's obsession. They could not ignore the mounting evidence, nor could they dismiss the connection between the photographs, the maps, and the trophies he had kept. Meanwhile, the families of Jessica Owens and Melissa Carter were desperate for answers. They had waited so long, clinging to the hope that their daughters were still alive, that they had simply gone missing for some unknown reason. But with each new discovery, that hope began to fade. The case was no longer just about a disappearance. It was about finding the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The police were now on a race against time, trying to piece together the final clues. They had to find the missing women, if they were still alive, and they needed to know why Peterson had targeted them. Was it purely for the thrill of watching them, or was there something deeper at play? What had driven him to commit these unspeakable acts? And most haunting of all, how many more women had he been watching? How many others were still out there, living in fear, unaware that they were being followed by someone who seemed to be invisible in the shadows? The case was growing increasingly complex, and the community began to fear the possibility that there were more victims hidden in the dark corners of Shreveport. The fear was palpable. Each missing woman, each new revelation about Peterson's activities, served as a reminder that evil could lurk in even the most familiar places. As Carl Peterson's trial began, Shreveport braced for the full extent of the darkness that had been hiding beneath the surface of its quiet community. For months, the town had been gripped by fear and uncertainty, and now, with Peterson in custody, the people demanded justice. But what they would learn in the coming weeks would shock them to their core. The prosecution had built a strong case. The photographs, the maps, and the personal items taken from the missing women were irrefutable evidence of Peterson's obsession. Yet there was still one question that lingered. Where were Jessica Owens and Melissa Carter? Were they still alive? Had Peterson kept them captive, or had they met a far worse fate? The police had searched his house, his van, and every inch of his property, but they had found no sign of the women. Without their bodies, the prosecution faced an uphill battle in proving their murders. Despite the mounting evidence, Peterson remained stoic throughout the trial, offering no explanation for his actions. He never once showed any emotion as the testimony unfolded, and his silence only added to the unsettling nature of the case. Some believed his calm demeanor was a sign of guilt, while others thought he was simply too cold to care. But the more the court learned about his past, the more chilling it became. Peterson's background, was as unremarkable as his life in Shreveport. He had been born in the town, raised in a modest home by parents who were known to be strict but not abusive. His childhood was ordinary, no history of trauma or abuse. He had graduated from high school, spent a few years working in various menial jobs, and eventually found his niche as a mechanic. There was nothing in his early years that would suggest he would become a predator. To many, this was the most terrifying part. Carl Peterson was just an average man, blending in with the crowd. He had no obvious motivations, no signs of a troubled past. He was just ordinary, but as the trial progressed, more was revealed about his relationships, or lack thereof. Peterson had never been married, never had any long-term relationships. His only interactions with women seemed to be those he had stalked from the shadows. Friends and co-workers testified that he had always kept to himself, never socializing or seeking out companionship. He had lived alone for years, his life consumed by his work and seemingly his obsession with watching others. It was as if he had no true connections to anyone, no meaningful relationships. Instead, he had become fixated on the women around him, observing their lives as though they were part of some twisted game. The defense, however, tried to argue that Peterson had simply been a victim of circumstance, that his obsessive behaviors were the result of a deeply repressed psyche. His attorney suggested that Peterson had never intended to harm anyone, that his actions were an attempt to connect with the women he had admired from afar. They painted him as a lonely man who had suffered from an inability to form normal relationships, someone who had lost himself in a world of delusion. The defense also pushed the idea that there was no clear evidence that Peterson had actually abducted or harmed anyone. All the prosecution had were photos and items that could have been taken without force. It was a desperate attempt to create doubt in the minds of the jury, but it wasn't enough to overshadow the sheer weight of the evidence against Peterson. In the midst of the trial, something unexpected happened. A third woman came forward, another woman who had been followed by Peterson, though she had never realized it at the time. Her name was Rachel Sanders, a 27-year-old teacher who had recently moved to Shreveport. Rachel described how she had often seen a black van parked near her apartment complex, how she had noticed someone watching her from a distance. She had never thought much of it, assuming it was a coincidence or just someone passing through. But as the investigation into Peterson deepened, she realized that the man she had seen was the same one who had been stalking Jessica and Melissa. Rachel's testimony sent shockwaves through the courtroom. She spoke with trembling hands, describing how she had felt a growing sense of unease as she noticed the van more frequently. She had seen it parked near her school, near her gym, and sometimes even outside her favorite coffee shop. For months, she had been unaware of Peterson's presence in her life, but now, looking back, she could recall all the strange little moments that had seemed insignificant at the time. The knowledge that she had narrowly escaped becoming one of his victims was chilling. Rachel's courage to speak out gave the prosecution a much-needed boost. Her testimony helped to paint a clearer picture of Peterson's long-standing obsession with women. He had been watching them, stalking them, for years, taking mental notes of their routines and habits. But Rachel's story also raised a terrifying possibility. How many other women had been living in fear without even knowing it? How many others had unknowingly crossed paths with Peterson, only to slip away unscathed? The more the trial revealed, the more it seemed as though Peterson had been playing a twisted game, a game in which he was the unseen observer and his victims were nothing more than pawns. He had kept detailed notes on each woman, cataloging their movements, their likes and dislikes, the places they visited, and the people they interacted with. To him, they were nothing more than objects to study, to collect, to manipulate. The idea that Peterson had watched these women from a distance, perhaps for months before making his move, added another layer of horror to the case. As the trial neared its conclusion, the jury deliberated for hours, weighing the evidence, the testimonies, and the chilling reality of what had transpired. There was little doubt in anyone's mind that Peterson had been responsible for the disappearances of Jessica Owens and Melissa Carter. The question now was whether the evidence was enough to convict him of murder, or if the defense could convince the jury that Peterson's actions had been driven by some form of psychological disorder, one that prevented him from fully understanding the consequences of his actions. In the end, it was the prosecution's case that carried the most weight. The jury found Carl Peterson guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder, as well as multiple counts of kidnapping, stalking, and unlawful detention. The verdict was met with a mixture of relief and horror. Relief that the man responsible for the terror in Shreveport had been brought to justice, but horror at the extent of his actions, and the realization that the town had been living with a predator in their midst for so long. Carl Peterson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The families of the victims were left to mourn, knowing that their daughters would never come home. But for the town of Shreveport, the trial was a painful reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones that walk among us unnoticed.